Vanner's days had become a relentless cycle of training and monotony. Each day, his group spent 2 to 3 hours practicing with the new weapon, only to return to their usual duties on the city wall. What frustrated Vanner most was the sight of his dorm mate from the firearms squad flaunting his shiny new weapon. The smug attitude that accompanied the boasting made Vanner clench his fists, but discipline forbade infighting. Otherwise, he would have silenced that grin long ago. Still, something about the situation didn't sit right with him. His compatriots in the firearms squad had joined mere days ago and were already engaging in live combat against demonic beasts. Meanwhile, the artillery team wasn't even allowed to fire their cannons during practice. Worse, the cannons were too massive to be transported onto the narrow wall walk, which was already packed with soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder. The logistics of deploying cannons on the wall seemed outright impossible. So, what was their purpose? Vanner's questions were answered during their next training exercise. Iron Axe led the artillery teams to the Chishui River, where Vanner's jaw dropped at the sight of a massive ship. Or was it? Its hull was crafted from gray stone, resembling the material used to build the town wall. The vessel was wide and squat, with 2 bare masts sticking out awkwardly. Was this truly a ship, or something else entirely? The men broke in a heated debate. "This is a pontoon bridge," declared Jop, who fancied himself well-traveled after accompanying or shipments to Long Song's stronghold. "It's built wide for stability. I've seen plenty like it down south. They'll link a few together with iron chains to span the river." Rodney sneered. "A pontoon with masts? That's absurd. And look, there's a steering wheel at the end. Pontoons don't need steering." Nelson chimed in, siding with Rodney. "Not to mention, that's clearly a cabin between the masts. It's a ship, no question." Vanner ignored the argument. His focus was on the training ahead. Iron Axe soon confirmed the truth. The vessel was named Little Town, a designation personally given by His Highness. It wasn't a bridge. It was a ship designed to carry cannons. 2 sets of sturdy poles on the deck marked where the cannons would be secured. Each vessel could carry 2 cannons at a time. Vanner's suspicions were confirmed. These cannons weren't meant for fighting demonic beasts. Instead, they would be deployed along the Chishui River, far from the beast-infested forests. Their first time boarding the ship was eye-opening. Despite the river's strong currents, the vessel was remarkably stable. It felt as solid as standing on land, save for the faint sway when the horses stepped aboard. Training soon began in earnest. Vanner noticed that Iron Axe meticulously timed each group's performance, recording the results. With only 2 spots available on the ship, it was clear the fastest teams would be chosen. This revelation lit a fire under Vanner's group, pushing them to train harder. Failure to secure a spot wouldn't just bruise their pride. It would mean missing out on improved pay. Finally, on the 7th day, Vanner's team experienced their first live firing. His Royal Highness Prince Roland himself came to observe, his presence electrifying the soldiers. They stood taller, their steps more confident. Vanner's team was the first to fire, thanks to their rigorous practice. The cannon roared to life, the deafening boom shaking the ground. The iron ball shot into the distance, landing over 500 meters away. Snow and mud erupted skyward on impact, and the ball bounced once before disappearing from sight. Vanner was awestruck by the cannon's destructive power. He couldn't imagine any armor capable of withstanding such an attack. After each shot, soldiers marked the landing positions and measured the distances. The process was repeated as the cannon's angle was adjusted using a scale at its base. Vanner quickly understood the purpose of the scale. Higher angles resulted in farther shots, much like archery. However, the cannon's speed and power were far beyond anything Vanner had ever seen. A wild thought crossed his mind. Could the cannonball's speed increase to the point where it never stopped? Testing the ship's crew. At the Chishui River, Little Town underwent its trial phase. Since Wendy would serve as the ship's primary source of propulsion with her wind-controlling abilities, Roland carefully selected a reliable crew who already knew about the witches and harbored no prejudice. Carter was appointed captain, with Brian as the helmsman. The sailors were Carter's trusted subordinates, while Titus Pine, Nana's father, took on the role of correspondent. This crew had frequent contact with witches and had shed their biases. Pine, in particular, was fiercely loyal, given his daughter's identity as a witch. The trials demonstrated Littletown's potential as a formidable weapon platform. Roland's vision of combining technology and magic was steadily becoming a reality, and Vanner felt both pride and awe at being part of such a historic moment. For Vanner and the others, this new era of warfare promised challenges and opportunities like never before. But as he gazed at the cannon, still warm from their last shot, he couldn't help but feel a shiver of anticipation. The world was changing, and he was standing at the center of it. Since Lightning was the only one among the crew with practical experience on the seas, she was given the role of navigator. The position thrilled her, but her excitement was tempered by her curiosity about Littletown, the unusual stone ship. Its peculiar design fascinated her. While crude in appearance, it possessed every essential feature of a functional vessel. Yet, despite her enthusiasm, she wasn't permitted to steer it herself, her father's long-standing refusal to let her helm a ship still shadowing her confidence. In keeping with tradition, Lightning christened the ship for its maiden voyage by smashing a bottle of wheat wine against its bow. She then gave the order to set sail, though Captain Carter was quick to echo her commands, determined not to let a little girl overshadow his authority. The sails of Littletown were an eclectic patchwork of animal hides: cowhide, sheepskin, wolf pelts, and even bear fur, giving the sails a striking mix of colors: browns, grays, and whites. Trapezoidal in shape, each sail was divided into sections supported by 4 beams. Iron rings threaded along a cable secured the sails to the mast, while a simple pull on the cable hoisted the entire assembly. To simplify operations, Littletown featured only 2 parallel sails positioned perpendicularly to the ship's centerline. Normally, such a design would hinder wind capture, rendering the second mast nearly useless. However, with Wendy's ability to control the wind, this layout allowed her to distribute the wind's force evenly, making steering far easier. Once the sails were set, Lightning ordered the dockworkers to release the ropes. The river's surface sparkled in the weak winter sunlight, with occasional snowflakes drifting lazily in the light breeze as the ship began its slow departure from the shore. Descending to the deck, Lightning positioned herself beside Brian at the steering wheel. "Right on full rudder," she called, her voice confident. Carter promptly echoed her. "Right on full rudder." Brian scratched his head in confusion. What does that mean? How many times do I turn it right?" Lightning rolled her eyes. "It means turn the wheel to the left," she said, exasperated. "Do I have to do it myself?" Realizing the crew's inexperience, Lightning took control. She leapt up and grabbed the oversized wheel, her small frame rising off the ground as she strained against its weight. The massive iron rudder resisted her efforts, its movement hindered by water resistance, but Lightning's ability to fly allowed her to maintain control. She noticed a small stabilizing fin at the base of the rudder and marveled. How did His Highness know to include this detail? Even seasoned sailors might not understand its function. Satisfied with the rudder's position, Lightning called up to Wendy, who stood atop the cabin. "Sister Wendy, you can start producing wind now." From her perch, Wendy sighed, finally understanding why the prince had asked if she feared heights. Her role as the ship's engine was a far cry from her usual tasks like drying clothes or preparing food. Extending her hands, she summoned a balanced stream of wind, channeling it evenly across both sails. To her surprise, maintaining consistent wind proved far more challenging than she'd anticipated. Unlike the powerful gusts she used in combat, this task required precise control and constant effort. Watching Anna's meticulous use of her powers flashed through Wendy's mind, and a pang of shame struck her. She resolved to practice her ability with the same dedication. Under Wendy's guidance, the sails billowed, creaking as the ship began to glide forward. The bow turned smoothly, and Carter exclaimed, "It's really moving." Sir Pine laughed heartily. His Royal Highness turned stone into a ship. Is there anything he can't do? Littletown drifted steadily toward the center of the river. However, Wendy's power alone couldn't counter the natural north wind, forcing the crew to rely on steering adjustments. Lightning attempted to guide Brian, but she quickly realized this was a skill he had to learn through experience. To accelerate his training, she instructed him to practice frequent turns, allowing him to understand the relationship between the steering wheel's movements and the ship's direction. After over an hour of navigating the Chishui River, Wendy's strength waned. Her magic wasn't depleted, but the biting cold and constant effort had sapped her physical endurance. Snow piled atop her coat and hat, and her limbs felt numb. When she swayed dangerously on the cabin roof, Lightning reacted immediately, swooping in to catch her before she could collapse. "Brian, take us back to the docks," Lightning shouted as she carried Wendy down to the deck. Brian turned the wheel, guiding the ship in a slow arc back toward the shore. Though the sails provided some shelter from the wind, the cold still bit at everyone aboard. Lightning stayed close to Wendy, shielding her as best she could. When Little Town finally reached the riverbank, the hull struck the shore with a jarring thud, causing everyone's hearts to race. Despite the loud collision, the ship appeared undamaged. The sailors hurried to furl the sails and lower the gangplank. Though their trial voyage had been far from smooth, their practice maneuvers had prevented them from drifting too far from border town. Lightning wasted no time, flying toward the castle with Wendy in her arms to ensure she received proper care. On the deck, Carter gazed at the stone ship with a mix of awe and trepidation. "Without a witch, I wouldn't dare sail this thing again," he muttered, shaking his head. The day's trial had proven the potential of Little Town, but it was clear the ship relied on more than just its design. It relied on the strength and coordination of all aboard.
Hey, welcome to Firescale Audiobooks. If you enjoy our audiobooks, please consider subscribing to the channel. Also, feel free to share your review in the comments section below.
Winter was the time of no harvest for most people of the north, especially near the Hermes Plateau. The months of the demons not only brought endless wind and snow, but furthermore brought cold, hunger, and death. However, for false-leg White, winter meant something different. Every winter, the church's envoy would come to his door to let him drive several turns to the west border of the kingdom. On the way to the border, he would collect suffering orphans with his carriage and bring them to the old holy city. For him, this was a good deal, since he would almost earn 20 silver royals for each trip to the border. What was even better was that he could also accumulate merits of doing good work. It was almost the end of this year's months of the demons, so this turn should be the last run of this season. "Your Honor, please go back to the carriage and stay inside. Outside, it will still snow for a long time, so you don't need to eat the wind and drink the snow every day like I do. You aren't allowed to freeze." "This is nothing." The church's messenger contradicted White and took a big gulp out of his jug before continuing. "In the new holy city, it can be much colder than it is here. At the plateau, leather clothes and armor aren't able to stop the cold. If you are there, the cold will come through every opening and drill into every part of your body. Without the usage of cold pills, no ordinary people can survive at that place." "What you said should be right," White nodded. He hadn't been to the new holy city, and he also didn't plan to go there. "Since only the cold and the demonic beasts existed there, why should I go there?" However, as an experienced coachman, it was easy for him to find another topic to speak about, a subject that would be preferred by the envoy. "Your gloves should be made from the leather of the wolves native to the west border of the Kingdom of Graycastle, right?" "Oh, you can see that." "Hey, my lord, I've been doing this work for 30 years, White proudly said. "First for the Baron, then for the Countess, and later even for the Wolf-Shark Kingdom's little princess. If it were not for the accident when I broke my legs, maybe I would still be working for the Count's house." They had nothing besides plenty of gold royals, and paid excellently for Graycastle's fur and silverware, jewelry from the Kingdom of Eternal Winter, and the Fjord's handicrafts. They demanded so much that I could never deliver enough. "So," the ambassador nodded, "this is the origin of your nickname? And what kind of accident were you involved in?" "Well, it was a refugee riot. The group of thugs didn't stop for anything as long as they could get something to eat from it," White disdainfully answered. He spat on the ground. "When they surrounded the carriage, I had no other choice than to urge the horse to run if I wanted to save the Countess. But it got frightened, threw me down, and turned over the carriage." "So you broke your leg?" the ambassador curiously asked. But what happened to the Countess? She got away since there were many cushions and thick quilts inside the carriage, so she got some light bruises. White barked. She just crawled out of the carriage and left me on the road to die. On my broken leg, I dragged my body home. He slapped his hand against the brass stick that showed from under his cut-off trousers. However, the Count's house threw me out on the pretext that I could not drive anymore. Those damn aristocrats. What a pity, the ambassador paused. But God did not abandon you. Now you are driving for the church. Yes, sir, answered White, but inside he thought no. If God were merciful, he wouldn't let me do this. Instead, he would have saved me when I needed him the most. At this moment, the cry of a young girl could be heard. We need a little pause. NOV. L. B / JNN. Hearing this, White pulled at the reins so that the two horses gradually stopped. At the moment the carriage had stopped, the ambassador jumped down and went to its back. Soon, a whip crack could be heard from behind the carriage. Poor child, thought White as he sighed. You have to endure it. This is your savior. If it weren't for the church's envoy, who always supported me through the winter, I would only be an unattended corpse at the side of the road. Soon, the ambassador came back, climbed up, and sat beside White and only commanded, "Go." "Brace yourselves, I am driving," shouted White as he shook his reins, removing the carriage. Are they all from the Wolfshark Kingdom? Almost the churches in every town in the kingdom takes in some of the orphans, especially during the winter, when there is a food and clothing shortage everywhere. We receive many times more people compared to the other seasons because of this. If we only depended on our church's own members, it wouldn't be enough. So we have to employ some drivers with good reputations to help us to transport the orphans to the oldie holy city. Until now you have done very well, White. My predecessor could only praise you. It is my privilege to be part of such a good deed, said White, honored. Your Excellency, will they also be sent to the monastery? I hate to ask. Though they are orphans, their characters aren't the same. Although some of them aren't so old, some of them have already done terrible deeds. So won't these people contaminate the pure and holy earth? God will judge them, and even if they are guilty, they will get the opportunity of salvation, answered the envoy with complete conviction. Will they? That's a good thing. Wright was amazed, but soon he raised his head and looked at the sky before he continued. It's late, sir. Shall we stay in the next town? If the weather tomorrow is good, we will arrive at the old holy city at noon. It's already this late, asked the ambassador. Look for an inn, and after you bring the carriage to the yard, you can prepare the food for the orphans. Okay. White agreed to the plan. This town belonged to the Wolfshark Kingdom, and if someone wanted to reach the old holy city, they had to go through this town. So, it wasn't White's first time here. Thanks to this, he quickly found the inn he had previously frequented. He drove the carriage into the yard, and then took some coins from the church's envoy to buy some food for the orphans. As usual, he bought sweet potato porridge, which was the most appropriate choice since it was cheap and still had a pretty good taste. After watching them divide the porridge, White limped back to the inn, asked for some bread with butter, and sat at the bar to eat. As for the envoy, he certainly had a better place to go. If White hadn't broken his leg 10 years ago, he would have gone to the tavern to order a glass of wine, and he would also have thrown some dice. He had always had a good hand for them. But now, White took his purse and found his room to sleep early. Later, in the evening, he heard some voices from the yard. So, he got up and lifted the curtains to control the situation. But White only saw that the church's drunken envoy had come back. The envoy opened the door of the carriage and went into it. Soon he returned outside, pulling 2 orphans with him. Beside the carriage, 2 people dressed in aristocratic clothes were already waiting. Seeing that it was only the envoy, White put the curtain down and went back under the warm blanket. This wasn't the first time he witnessed the envoy doing this. Actually, it was a regular thing for him. Being alive is the greatest happiness. He thought they have just to endure the pain for the moment. You only have to survive until we reach the old holy city. Then you will be able to start a new life. At least in the monastery, you won't have to fear starving. Thinking until here, White yawned and soon fell asleep. At dawn, he got the envoy and drove on. The last part of the journey went without incident, and they even reached the old holy city 2 hours sooner than expected. There were already other churches' carriages waiting for them. It seemed that these poor devils still had some way to go, but all this had nothing to do with him. "This is your reward," the envoy called to White and threw a bag toward him. White took the coins out of the bag and counted them twice. Indeed, it was 20 silver royals. So he nodded and said, "I hope I will see you again in the coming year." But the envoy did not answer. Instead, he waved his hand to indicate that White could depart. White noticed that in addition to him, several other coachmen were doing the same job. Are they from the other kingdoms? He asked himself, but soon he noticed something strange. It seemed only girls would come down from the carriages. So when the church adopts orphans, they only adopt girls? He shook his head, threw this problematic thought to the back of his head, and started the journey back home. Bishop Maine followed the circular staircase leading into the earth. The staircase, with a depth of at least 4 times that of the cathedral's highest tower and a diameter of about 20 feet, was built in a natural doline and lead directly into a strategically positioned and spacious castle. The beginning of the staircase was well lit by skylight pathing through the windows of the high dome above, giving the twisting and turning stone walls an icy color. But when following the steps, the stairway quickly darkened, seemingly fusing the walls into one. But after some time at the center of the staircase, the reflection of a blue light could be seen, and the deeper one went, the brighter it would become. So even without a torch, they would never fall into a pitch-black predicament. At the foot of the staircase, a pathway that was firmly attached to the rock wall meandered around a dark hole. The path was cut out of granite, formed by many rectangular pieces 3 fingers thick. The path was wide enough for 2 people walk side by side. One end of each granite piece was embedded into the rock wall, while the other end was in the air. In order to prevent accidental falls, there were wooden fence posts that were connected by rope at the side of the hole. Maine didn't count the number of steps he walked. In the end, there were just too many, but he knew that embedding every piece of stone was a tough task. The masons hired by the church had to lean on a rope to hang down. While they knocked out suitably deep holes in the hard rock afterwards, they had to insert the granite plates into the holes. Each action had to be done very carefully because every rope slippage or breakage lead to a fall to the bottom, which happened to more than 300 people. If the church's cathedral on the surface was a symbol for the unyielding spirit of the church, then the hidden castle in the Hermes Plateau was the real core of the church. A piece of God's stone of retaliation was embedded at the edge of every step, and a guard was placed on every 100th step. For last line of defense, there was even a squadron of the God's punishment army that was always ready to face an attack from intruders. Many bags of sand and gravel were buried between the cathedral and the underground castle. This was in case every line of defense in the holy city had failed. If every important person was evacuated, the Pope could start the trap and bury everything under a deep layer of sand and gravel. Although it wasn't Maine's first visit to the underground castle, the feeling of walking on air still made him feel dizzy. Especially after some time, he would always have the illusion of falling. So he was a little relieved when he finally had once more solid ground under his feet. At the bottom of the sinkhole was a huge white stone disc with a surface as smooth as a mirror. When standing above it, someone could even clearly see their own reflection. Through a cleverly designed construction, the light coming through the windows within the dome was so reflected that it directly hit the millstone. Thanks to this, even without lighting a torch, the bottom of the doline was never dark. When reaching the bottom of the doline, they would discover that the sun is not colorless. After being reflected by the grindstone, the light would become blue. Yet when looking upwards, the blue light would let the sinkhole shine in a cool color. But when taking a closer look, someone would discover that there were countless dust particles flying upwards, just like the minute creatures recorded within the ancient book. The holes within the wall of the mountain were caves formed by nature, and the church only opened up the entries to further expand and built the Hermes Castle. But thanks to Theseus' holes which extended in all directions, the air could flow freely, so that the air at the bottom of the doline didn't feel rotten or oppressive. NOVL/B//JNN. When Maine stepped through the door into the castle's main area, he was suddenly surrounded by a strong defense force. There were 5 soldiers called judges who guarded every entryway. The judges were the church's most loyal soldiers. Once they were accepted into this group and started their work, they would forever live in the castle, never able to return to the surface. In fact, only he and the Pope were able to enter and later exit the castle. Even the 2 archbishops Heather and Tayfun weren't allowed to enter here. But even Maine didn't know how many channels the castle had. In addition to the main channel leading south, there were many side branches leading away from the main branch, and when following the side channels, they would split again into many more branches. Some were used by the church, while others were sealed. He had heard that during the construction of the castle, a few artisans strayed into those channels not marked as safe, which led to them becoming lost, never able to find their way back. The vertical main channel led directly to the depths of the mountain. Around every 300 feet, about 100 meters, Maine had to cross a checkpoint. He knew that the church was using each segment between 2 checkpoints for a different task. The most outside area was used as the living area for the warriors who had to stay their whole life in the castle. The second segment was used as archives for the storage of instruments and fragments of ancient books. The third section was the jail area, where prisoners were housed who weren't allowed to see the light ever again, innocents included. After crossing through the third checkpoint, Maine stopped. Further in was the castle's secret area. All of the church's research materials and inventions originated from this place, and without the Pope's authorization, no one was allowed to enter. Since he became the archbishop 3 years ago, he had only stepped into this area once before. When Maine walked closer, he took the left path. After a short walk, the way was ended by a door, with a plate at the height of the chest on it on which read Elders. Maine nodded to the guards and ordered, "Open the door." Behind the door, the corridor continued. There were burning torches hanging on the wall, like small sparks of light within a sea of darkness, continuing along the path until the end. On both sides of the road were many wooden doors, and in the middle of each door hung a plate with a number on it. One of the judges who followed Maine raised a torch to illuminate the surroundings. While walking down the channel, Maine looked all the while at the numbers on the plates. When he finally saw the number 35 modeled into the plate, he stopped and pulled a key out of one of his pockets and inserted it into the keyhole, turning it lightly. At the bottom of the doline, the sound of opening the lock was especially harsh, and its echo could be heard even at the end of the channel. As if it was a signal flare, suddenly many cries could be heard through the doors. There were calls from men and women. When listening carefully, Maine could understand some of them. "Quickly save me. Help me. Please kill me," and the like. But Maine was unmoved by the cries. He only ordered the guard standing beside the door to immediately shut it after he entered the room, leaving the chaos of screams outside. Behind iron rails, the bishop saw an old man sitting on his bed. Perhaps he was not so old, but now his hair had already turned white, and his face was covered by wrinkles. His beard looked like he hadn't groomed it in a long time, almost reaching up to his neck. Since he hadn't seen the sun for a long time, his skin had become terribly pale, and his hands and feet were as thin as bamboo. Maine glanced at the food plate behind the rails, which looked like it hadn't been touched. Registering this, he sighed. "You should treat yourself better. The church doesn't lack for food. And the meals are even made according to a king's standard, except for the wine. Even the fish, it's first-rate cod coming from Port of Bluewater. You should be familiar with its taste. Right, Your Majesty, King Wimbledon?" It took a moment before the old man showed a reaction. He slowly lifted up his quilt, moved it to the bedside, and looked in the direction of the archbishop. Then he opened his mouth and asked, "If it were you who was locked up in this damnable place, do you think you would be able to eat?" His voice wasn't easy to understand. It sounded like his throat had been blocked by something. "Half a year. I'm already trapped here for 6 months, without any news. Tell me, how are my sons and daughters doing?" When taking a closer look at the cell, May noticed that it seemed like one wall was scored with a nail. Is the old man using this method to calculate the date? He moved to a chair facing the king and then asked in return, "Why ask about things that will only make you unhappy?" The king kept his silence for a long while, but eventually spoke. "It doesn't matter to me. After all, you will kill me anyway, right?" Maine only answered with one word, Yes. Then, as a dying man, what does pleasure mean to me before I die? I just want to know their situation. The longer Wimbledon spoke, the more his voice resembled a growl. In the end, what else should I expect? Mayne thought. After all, as a king, he had learned to have a strong spirit and demeanor. When the king had been kidnapped and replaced by a devout, on the road to Hermes, he had repeatedly tried to break free. Then when he was imprisoned, he wasn't corrupted by madness. Instead, he had always tried to negotiate his freedom. Even during all the abuse, he never released a scream, which was very rare in this jail. If it wasn't impossible to change the plan, Mayne really wouldn't want to waste such a person whose only bad point was being on the wrong side of their conspiracy. Perhaps since I've already personally come, I should just inform him about the status quo, the archbishop thought. Otherwise, I could just voice the command, and the next moment one of the judges can come and end his life. So Mayne finally slowly said, "Your eldest son, Gerald, is already dead. He was beheaded by your second son, Timothy, on charges of treason. Your third daughter, Garcia, has declared the independence of the southern border region, conferring herself as the Queen of Clearwater. So a war between her and Timothy is inevitable. As for your fourth son and your fifth daughter, we do not get much information about them. Well, they're still alive. What are you talking about? Rebellion? Independence? What did you do?" asked the king, enraged. "We let them fight out who would become the next king," explained Mayne with pleasure. "We spread your children through the whole kingdom and declared whoever governed their territory the best would become the next king." Hearing this, Wimbledon closed his eyes in pain, trying to shut out the world. After a long time, he finally whispered, "Why do you do all this? You took advantage of the prayer day, brought me into the compartment to pray in isolation. There you stripped me of my clothes, and also took my God's stone of retaliation. Then you used the ability of a witch to replace me with another person. So with this replacement, you could have obviously slowly taken over the country, let the church gain control of every town. So why did you need to give out the order for the Battle of the Throne?" I cannot. Kiki, because he got more and more enraged, he began to cough severely, shaking throughout his whole body. N/O/vel/b//in.c//om. We just couldn't issue the command, which would lead to massacring your children one after another. Mayne continued his verbal attack to finish off the former king. Maybe you wouldn't have worked against us, but your children mostly wouldn't act the way you want them to. They would grow up, develop, and have their own thoughts. Just like you see from your third daughter, Garcia. She already started her project to take over the port of Clearwater 5 years ago. So even without the Battle of the Throne, at the point when you would naturally die, do you think she would just stand at the side and look how Gerald would ascend the throne? But the most important reason for us to act was that we don't have the time to wait for the natural cause to get rid of you. You should have already noted that the power of the witch isn't permanent. Damn you. What would the church get from the fight between my children? The church will also sink into a sea of fire. Many of their believers will get killed during the war, and the kingdom will become a total mess. Talking until here, Wimbledon suddenly got a distracted look, not believing his upcoming thought. "Do you want to?" Another burst of severe coughs interrupted the king's speech once more. When he was finally able to speak again, his voice became as thin as a gossamer, as if that array of coughing had consumed all his remaining energy. "You want to destroy the royal family." "Exactly, but it would be more accurately to speak about the royal power." Mayne couldn't help himself from praising the king within his heart for his keen judgment. Even after staying for 6 months in the completely dark dungeon, by not losing his consciousness, he could already be regarded as strong-willed, but he has even managed to keep his intelligence. The only other people who would be able to do this can be counted on one hand. The monarchy will always be a hindrance to the development of the church. No matter how weak it becomes, it will always rise again, just like weed. So only by completely eradicating it will the church be able to genuinely control the kingdom. Suddenly, Wimbledon looked a lot more aged. Previously, only his outer appearance seemed to be old, but now it seemed that his spirit had left him and his eyes dimmed. The Kingdom of Graycastle is the kingdom with the largest territory in the mainland. It is also the largest number of soldiers. So in the case of a full frontal war, my church can only be at a disadvantage. We had already planned all this for a long time now. During a civil war, your kingdom will lose a lot of soldiers and mercenaries. After waiting for only 2 to 3 years, our God's punishment army will be able to easily take over the whole territory of your kingdom. But you don't need to be sad. Your kingdom isn't the only one we are subjugating. The other 3 kingdoms are all facing the same situation. Soon the mainland will no longer have the 4 kingdoms. Instead of the Wolf-Shark Kingdom, the Kingdom of Eternal Winter, Kingdom of Dawn, and the Kingdom of Graycastle, there will be only one regime, the Church, ruling over all the countries. Wimbledon turned completely silent. The man who had won the throne from his brother by force of arms was now like a man who had lost his life. Even for Maine it was hard to bear, but in his mind he hadn't the slightest thought of regret. The church had also invested a lot into this plan. A large number of outstanding believers had been willingly used as pawns, regardless of the danger to themselves. For example, the man who had played Wimbledon 3 was a devoted member of the judges. He was a strong believer and absolutely loyal to the church, and would have originally received the transformation ceremony, becoming a member of the God's punishment army. However, in order to complete the mission, he got his appearance changed by a witch into that of you. So when he died in the castle, he didn't receive any honor. Before the mission, he could have carved his name on top of the church's monument on Hermes, but now the church could only bury his name forever. When Maine came to the conclusion that Wimbledon wouldn't speak any further, he took a small porcelain bottle out of a pocket and gave it to him to drink. When Wimbledon had collected himself and drank the potion, he spoke his final words, "Curse." "Yes?" asked Maine, waiting for the king to continue. "I curse you. I'll be waiting for you in the depths of hell." Wimbledon's voice grew fainter with every word. In the end, Maine had even to concentrate if he wanted to understand what was said. It's a pity that there is no hell in this world. Even if there is one, it isn't a place where I belong to. Everything we're doing is for the continuing of humanity. Only by unifying the 4 kingdoms are we able to get enough power to confront the true enemy, or else. The archbishop stopped his speech when he saw that Wimbledon's hand had lost all of its strength and had fallen to the ground. His head twisted to one side, and his chest stopped to move. This was the end of a king, but it's our beginning, he thought. Maine took up the bottle and put it back into his pocket. Then he opened the door and stepped into the quiet corridor, which gave the feeling like there had never been any cries. He only explained to the member of the judges how to deal with the aftermath, and then he left the castle without looking back even once. Lise didn't know how long she could still hold on. Her return to the camp in the impassable mountain range from the wildland took her nearly half a month. In order to avoid detection by demonic beasts, she carefully hid inside the thick and solid trunk of a tree to confirm that there were no demonic beast activity within the vicinity before running to the next place to hide. Despite her worry of the slow-marching speed, she had no other choice. Once she was detected by demonic beasts, she wouldn't be able to survive alone. More than a dozen sisters had fallen under the attack of the devils, and the sisters who survived weren't good at fighting. During the time when Iron Hand jumped into the crowd and started his massacre, they had scattered in all directions, but in the end, there were only a few who were still alive and able to come back to the camp. Thinking of all the death, the pain within Lise's heart didn't stop. The action of having to always hide herself during the escape consumed a large amount of magic power. Thus, she was only able to cover a distance of 10 miles daily. In particular, she always had to save enough power to survive the night. Since all of the rations she had at hand were eaten, she also had to look for wild fruits to sate her constant hunger. In addition, the heat spell within her Witches Cooperation Association emblem had also run out of power, so she could only use bark to wrap tightly around herself. Every time she thought about the deaths of the young witches, who weren't even allowed to mature and who she had promised to protect, she couldn't stop her tears from falling. And as if all of this wasn't enough, during one night, when she was wrapped in her tree trunk, she was constantly attacked by the demon's bite. After the constant attack of mental and physical blows, she had completely forgotten about this. Suddenly, she felt as if her chest was torn open, and the pain quickly spread throughout her whole body. The pain attacked her so suddenly that she almost instantly lost her consciousness. She was only able to fight back when she bit her tongue, tasted the blood flowing in her mouth. Under the constant torture, Leaves thought of giving up several times, But the thought of the possibility that more than 20 fleeing sisters, with serious injuries which only she was able to heal, were waiting in the camp for her return gave her the power to fight against the bite. Fortunately, she didn't have to suffer for a long time under the demon's bite. When she finally broke out from the suffering, she discovered that the tree trunk surrounding her body had a huge gap. Even worse, it was wet with her blood. So in order for the smell of her not to be discovered by demonic beasts, she had to fight against the pain and exhaustion and take off her clothes before fleeing to another tree. At the same time, she grew some green leaves on a bare branch and sewed warm clothes out of them. Under the guidance of her magic, the branch became a needle and the leaves' veins became her thread. During her escape, she couldn't eat either cooked food or drink warm water. When she finally entered the impassable mountain range, she even added 2 additional layers of leaves to her clothes, tightly wrapping both her hands and feet. But all this wasn't enough against the rapidly falling temperature and the ankle-deep snow, resulting in frostbite at her toes. So with this way of stopping and dragging on, with no feeling in her feet, she finally managed to return to the camp. At the moment she saw the familiar figure of one of her sisters, Leaves fell to the ground, unconscious. When she woke up 2 days later, due to the long time that her feet had been exposed to the low temperatures, her injuries had become so serious that even her own herbal medicine couldn't stop the spreading gangrene. They had no other choice than to take the last resort and cut off 2 toes from both her right and left foot. These sacrifices didn't bother Leaves much, since she was able to survive. Compared to those sisters who had never come back, she was very lucky. However, when she saw that her surviving sister's arms were all wrapped in white clothes, great sorrow spread out uncontrollably from the bottom of her heart. At the moment of departure, there was already only 42 sisters, but now there were only 6 survivors. When Leaves was finally able to calm down, she asked the others how they fared. NOVLB //JNN. As she already knew, during their fight with the devils, the witches with abilities incapable of combat took the opportunity to escape to the camp in the impassable mountain range. During their first night, they were attacked by demonic beasts, a group consisting of wild boar species. Everyone who was unable to fight had to flee once more. The fact that they were already attacked again by a group of demonic beasts was clearly a bad omen, but there was nothing they could do against it. The next morning, after a new attack from wolf-like shaped demonic beasts, only 8 witches were able to escape. Fortunately, after they had entered the impassable mountain range, the demonic beasts weren't able to keep up. When they had finally reached the camp some days ago, 2 sisters were attacked by the demon's bite. Maybe it was because the traumatic experiences of the last few days were too great and the future prospect was too dark, but they didn't have the will to fight and weren't able to survive the demon's bite. Since there was no battle which was able to come back, everyone had thought that they had died under the hands of the devils, so no one had expected that Leaves would come back. Finally, someone asked, "So, what happened to our other sisters? Scarlet, Windseeker, and furthermore our mentor Kara. Did they survive like you?" Leaves shook her head and whispered, "I am the only one who survived." "Do you?" Scroll quietly began to speak, but since she could already guess the answer, she said instead, "Then you have a good rest." Also, she hesitated for a moment. "Leaves, there is one more point." "What?" asked Leaves, exhausted. "When you were in a coma, we sisters had talked and come to the conclusion that in the case that Kara doesn't come back, we hope that you will take the position of our mentor." Suddenly being asked this question, Leaves became distracted, so she closed her eyes to think. "Well, yes. Our Witch Cooperation Association has suffered such a fatal blow. If we do not immediately select a new leader, I'm afraid we will soon fall apart. But the purpose of our society was to seek the Holy Mountain and obtain freedom and peace. Now the search for the Holy Mountain is over. No, the Holy Mountain itself is a hoax. It does not exist in the impassable mountain range, nor in the wildlands. Then, why should our society continue to exist?" Leaves' mind was in total chaos. Even so, she wasn't looking at them, but she could still feel the eyes of her sisters, waiting for her answer. Her sisters needed a person to lead them and guide them forward, someone who hadn't already given up. After long silence, Leaves finally spoke, We will go looking for Nightingale." Hearing her decision, the other sisters began to shout in disorder. "What? Why should we go looking for her? Do you mean we should also go to Border Town? What if she lied to us? Wendy is there too. She might have died long ago." Having enough of the chaos, Scroll clapped her hands, let the others quiet down, and then she asked Leaves, "What should we do if what Nightingale said is also a hoax?" "You can wait outside of the town, far enough to be safe," answered Leaves as she opened her eyes. "Let me find out the situation first before determining if Nightingale had lied. So, for now, I will take the post of mentor, but if I die in town, Scroll will take over command and lead the sisters to safety." "But I," began Scroll, but she was soon interrupted by Leaves. "I know your ability is not suitable for fighting, and your ability is not much help for the daily operation of the camp. But now I understand that the strength of the ability isn't important for the rank of leader. The mentor should be a guide, instead of being the strongest, but unfortunately, it is too late for us now. If the cautious and patient Wendy was our mentor, wouldn't the outcome have been complete different? You and Wendy were the first to join the Witch Cooperation Association, so you are already an elder sister. You crossed the whole kingdom on your march from the east to reach the impassable mountain range, so you have a lot of experience. You are cautious, and you don't think you are better than everyone else. So, there is no one who is better suited to be the mentor of us sisters than you." Afterwards, Scroll was silent for a moment until she said, "What if what Nightingale said is true? Then there is no reason why our Witch Cooperation Association should exist any longer," Leaves slowly explained. "After all, that would mean Border Town is our holy mountain. Ready? Strike!" Hearing this command, Vanner put all of his strength into striking at his target with his pike. He held it with both hands, and as he hit the wolf's head, the pike gave off a cracking sound. The wolf had fluffy fur, and its eyes were copper red. When it opened its mouth, Vanner saw 2 rows of fangs, in which the largest fangs were as big as his thumb. It was the first time that he had come so close in contact with a demonic beast. While it was trying to hit him with its claws, it was even throwing snowflakes at his face. Vanner felt like his brain had gone blank, and he was acting on instincts learned during training, like subconsciously gripping the pike tighter, continuing to drive the pike further. Vanner suddenly got the feeling that time was flowing slower. He saw that the pike had bowed to its maximum. However, the pike wasn't able to penetrate deep enough into the demonic beast's belly, giving Vanner the thought that the wolf's sharp claws would tear his cheeks open. Suddenly a bang was heard. The pike wasn't able to withstand the momentum of the wolf, and finally broke into 2 pieces. At the same moment of the breaking sound, the time flow turned back to normal, and the wolf fell down. Its claws landed on the city wall, scraping a series of marks into the debris. The other half of Vanner's pike smashed onto the city wall along with the wolf. "Guns, loading is complete. Fire at will." Suddenly a gun barrel was extended on each side of Vanner. Seeing this, Vanner stepped a half-step back as fast as possible and raised his head to avoid the smoke and debris that would hit his eyes. As for saving his ears, he had no time for it. Soon after the gunfire subsided, Vanner stepped back to the front, where he discovered that a number of demonic beasts at the wall's base laid, slain. The one Vanner had stabbed laid also between them. When he turned his head, he could see his roommate proudly grinning at him. "One only needs a week to learn to use your weapon, so there is nothing to be proud about." Vanner took only a glance. Then he switched his line of sight back to the battlefield. In a situation like this, His Highness artillery team would come in handy, but at this time they still had to rely on these crutches. "Your pike is broken, so take this new one." Cat's Paw handed Vanner a new pike. "Is this group of demonic beasts crazy? They've been attacking us for 2 to 3 hours already, right?" "Yes, they are crazy," answered Vanner, taking the pike and stepping back into place to wait for the next wave of attack. "How late is it?" "It's almost noon." Cat's Paw sighed. Taking advantage of the hunter overseer's lack of attention, he took on both sides. "What's with Jop and the Rodney brothers? Don't look for them. Do you want to be killed by the wolves?" Vanner snapped. "They were assigned to the other walls. They are probably in the 3rd or the 4th group." "How were you able to change into Group 1? "I belong to the replacement team," Cat's Paw laughingly answered. "Whenever there is a need, I will come and help. In the last wave, An uncle was wounded, and now it's my turn dash. Make ready dash, sounded the hunter overseer's voice. Interrupting Cat Paw's words. When looking down the wall, a dozen of quickly approaching demonic beasts could be seen. They were already so close that he could discern the various kinds of demonic beasts. This wave only had 2 wolves. The others were wild boars, a species of fox, and a species of bear, which were no big threat to the wall. NOV. L. B/JNN. Pierce. Nevertheless, he still obeyed the instructor's orders, carrying out a unified pike attack. Sure enough, this time, his pike thrust only hit the air. But when he recovered his pike, Vanner saw that the 2 wolves were already shot down by a group of other hunters. Since this wave of demonic beasts was slower, the hunter team had squeezed between the strike team and shot as they pleased. They had been undergoing this cycle of fixed action already from dawn until the present. When the first horn was sounded, most people were still asleep. Vanna yawned. This time, the attack of the demonic beasts was more intense than ever before. Usually they had to maintain this kind of battle for only 1 or 2 waves, but today, the demonic beasts were piling up at the base of the wall. They had already been replaced by the second militia team halfway, so that they could eat something, rest for a short moment, and then return to the wall. But unexpectedly, Vanner found himself much calmer than he had previous thought he would be. So when he heard that the gun team had to step back, he let them through, just as rehearsed in the previous weekdays. At first, they seemed like strange rules and regulations, but now they came in handy and were incredibly effective. The others looked almost the same as Vanner. They all firmly grasped their pikes and had a serious look on their face, but some of them looked very nervous. However, everyone stood still with a straight body, and no one stepped a step back. However, Vanna knew that the biggest push to the morale hadn't come from the daily training. Instead, it came from His Highness. At the moment after the firearms team shot, Vanner secretly glanced at the middle of the castle wall. It was the position where His Highness stood, overlooking the battle. Shortly after the horn sounded for the first time, His Highness had stepped onto the top of the city wall. Since then, he had stood on the wall, continually holding the defense line without any rest. Even when it was time to eat, he didn't step down. Instead, His Highness remained on top of the wall and sent his chief knight to personally get the breakfast. When Vanner recalled the behavior of the last lord, he remembered that the Lord had withdrawn by boat as quickly as possible at the beginning of the months of the demons. The Lord was followed by the other nobility, and then by the whole civilian population. As long as they had some silver royals, they would flee by boat, but if they had no money, they could only use their own feet to flee to Longsong's stronghold. Thinking back at this, Vanner felt completely refreshed. Yes, the army from the Lord of Longsong's stronghold and the Prince's border town militia team was completely different. The former group completely relied on their armor and weapons, and often tyrannized the area within the new and old districts, even suppressing and blackmailing foreign businessmen. But in Vanner's view, apart from the captain from the second militia team, there was no difference between rogues and them. Led by His Royal Highness, the militia was such a powerful team that they weren't even afraid of blocking the demonic beasts outside of border town, making it impossible for them to advance. In the past, only Longsong Stronghold was able to do this. Just look at Fishballs. He was a former gangster in the old district. He was often the object of ridicule, but after joining the militia team and picking up the pike, he became a role model as a good citizen. There was also Fermi. His head was too big, and he was a little slow, so he was often beaten up, laughed at by the people of the old district. But now, when fighting with a pike, not only did he become extremely fast and ruthless, but also more skilled than most people. Every time when the others had already finished their training, he would still thrust out 100 slashes, because His Highness had once said, if the inflexible bird wants to overtake the more nimble ones, it has to catch up with their pace, and then do even more. In the beginning, it was obviously only for the second egg, but now the soldiers were glad that they had joined the militia. Every day there was subtle changes in everyone, and every day they could train harder than yesterday. Vanner thought that he wasn't the only one who felt this way. Rather, he thought everyone would feel like this. He did not know how to describe his feelings. Perhaps it was best described by the words often used by His Highness. They were a team like never seen before. Woo! Woo dash! Suddenly, two short horn blows could be heard. This was the early warning system for an approaching mixed species. So Vanna looked into the distance and discovered a mixed species with wings and a lion's head, which was very similar to the beast that broke through the last time. Today this is our second meeting, he thought, but this time it isn't the same as last time. In addition to the gun team, we also have help from other forces. When he turned his head to the side and looked towards the middle of the wall, he could see a little girl with blonde hair floating beside the prince. "Don't be so hasty. Now isn't the time to act," said Roland. He could only sigh when looking at Lightning, who was eagerly flying around. God only knows why she is so interested in fighting against that demonic beast. It's obvious that she isn't the fighting type. But, compared with ordinary people, this little girl doesn't even show the least bit of fear. Just follow the same pattern we used when dealing with the last one. Don't try to be brave. You're just a lure so that it will focus its attention onto you. Always maintain a high degree of awareness. Even though it cannot fly, when it jumps up, it's still a very serious threat. I already know about that. Lightning spoke with a voice full of confidence. It isn't my first fight with something like this. Rest assured, I already know my limit. This time, it won't even be able to touch my clothes. During their talk, the mixed species had come even closer to the wall. It had already crossed the barriers and leaped in the direction of the unguarded area, trying to climb the wall. But this time, it was ignored by the militia members. They just kept defending their own sector, always waiting for the hunter captain's next stab command. "Then, we begin the special operations mission against this mixed species," shouted Roland. Hearing this, Lightning, who was already flying out, stopped for a moment and looked back to Roland. "What's up?" "That phrase of yours." Lightning thought it through once more, then shook her head. It seemed slightly strange. "Well, forget it, I'm off." Seeing the little girl's small figure flying quickly away, Roland turned towards Anna and Nightingale and asked, embarrassed, "Did you also thought that it was strange?" Well, they both nodded. "All right, it seems even in this place these two lines are strange. You both can go now as well. Be careful. N/O/vel/B//jin.C//om. Your Highness, take care." Nightingale bowed to Roland. Then she took Anna's hand and pulled her off into the fog. Roland put his arms behind his back, standing straight while facing the wind, trying to imitate how a boss would look like. He knew that many soldiers, when they had the time to catch their breath, would secretly glance at him. Because of this, even though his feet were already numb, he stood stoically at the highest point of the wall, clearly visible to everyone, demonstrating that the prince was always on their side. Since he couldn't put himself into combat, this way he could still serve to inspire them. This time, the intensity of the demonic beast attacks had exceeded all attacks previous. According to Iron Axe, during last year's month of demons, there would always only appear 1 or 2 mixed species. But this year, there were already 4 attacks of them on Border Town. The duration of these attacks was also unusually long. Even now, groups of 12 or even larger would emerge from the forest, always continuing to dash towards the city wall. Fortunately, the flintlock production has increased in the last month, and I'm now able to send out a team of 100 armed with flintlocks. Without them, I would have never been able to guarantee such a high killing speed. If we had to use crossbows, I'm afraid killing all of them would have been very difficult. In the long run, the advantage of guns, which needed less physical exertion, will become even more apparent. Of course, the large consumption of gunpowder was enough to give Roland a headache. He had already ordered more than 20 packs of explosives from the warehouse, which tore a huge hole in his reserves, so he was already thinking about rationing gunpowder. At the same moment, Lightning was already flying around the mixed species' head. She fished a stone from her pocket and threw it at the beast's head. The stone accurately hit the target's head, startling it so that it jumped forcefully back, only to discover that the attack actually come from the sky. To provoke it further, Lightning flew always at a low altitude and directly in front of its head, slowly luring it towards the town center. Although the mixed species certainly had the ability to think, but seeing this annoying little girl flying around in front of it, it didn't feel any threat. So it immediately pounced up, opened its wings, and in a few jumps it quickly crossed more than 100 meters. Lightning, seeing it prepare for a jump, immediately flew a bit higher and turned around, always keeping a few cottages and a street between herself and the beast. In this way, after 7 or 8 turns around, she was finally able to lure it to the town center, which was the ambush location on which Nightingale and she had previously agreed on. As a former lion, its sense of smell was naturally very sensitive. It should even be able to discover Nightingale even when she was in her world of fog. Because of this problem, they had to pull the demonic beast's attention away from them before Nightingale and Anna could start their surprise attack. For this kind of job, Lightning was perfectly suited. She was able to enrage the mixed species so much that it jumped around like a maniac with an open, wide mouth, always trying to get at this annoying fly. But Lightning, who didn't have to bear any weight, was always a small distance away from it, always flying up and down teasingly, making each jump fruitless. At the same time, and from another direction, Nightingale also arrived at the town square. Compared to Lightning, in her world of the fog, she could ignore all houses and fences, always moving in a straight line towards her goal. Since Anna's flame was only able to cover up to 10 steps, 5 meters, she had to get close to the mixed species, so she closed on it from behind, hoping to not be discovered. When they had to face the mixed species for the first time, this part was very troublesome. However, now it was already their second run against this kind of mixed species, and Nightingale had already gotten fully familiar with Anna's attack. So when they still were 30 feet away from the beast, she raised her speed to the limit, covering the distance in an instant, as if it was in only a single step. When Anna was able to see again, she discovered that the mixed species tail was already directly in front of her face. "Attack now!" cried Nightingale. Around Anna, the black and white world swapped away like a wave. Within the blink of an eye, she was back to the familiar town square, directly releasing her green flame from the tip of her finger and expanding it into a great fire cage, covering the whole demonic beast. Facing this flame, Nightingale had to hurriedly retreat. Even only feeling the heat wave was already enough to make her feel like she was burning. Enclosed by the cage of fire, which was even able to melt steel, the mixed species did not have any time to struggle. It instantly turned into a ball of flame and crushingly fell to the ground. It seems they were already able to solve the problem, Wendy informed him when she discovered the green flame in the distance. In the absence of Nightingale, it was her turn to protect Roland. "It seems like I won't get any part in the play. If possible, I would like it if it could stay this way," Roland answered, still maintaining his straight stance, pretending like he was riding along an easy road. Having said that, he still knew that without the help of the witches defending the town, the jumping mixed species would have thrown the militia once more into chaos. But today, even Nana had come to the walls, giving fast treatment to the injured soldiers. Her father was always at her side, protecting her. Today was the first time that Roland publicized the power of the witches in front of all the militiamen, and he was very pleased. Within the ranks, the love for their angel Nana rose to new highs, but when Anna and Nightingale killed the mixed species together, the crowd also began to cheer loudly. Of course, he clearly knew that not everyone wouldn't mind them. Such a situation like with the militia was very rare. But when they were fully accepted by the militia, he would still try to get them accepted by the whole town. Suddenly, the sound of gunfire began to taper off, and Roland noticed that the demonic beasts began to evacuate the wall. Are they finally retreating? He couldn't believe his eyes. But just at this moment, a beam of light broke through the thick clouds, covering the ground, followed by a second, then a third. Soon, tens of thousands rays of lights broke through the holes within the clouds. Then all the light beams merged into one, becoming dazzling and unable to look at. The earth had suddenly brightened up. The day when the sun rises again is the end of all evil. There was a short moment of stillness on the wall, but then a wave of cheering swept across the wall, towards the direction of Border Town. Gradually, the townspeople came out of the houses and also started to cheer, welcoming the long-missed sunshine, celebrating their surviving of the winter, or in order to thank the prince. In the end, all the cheering merged into a flood, resounding throughout the entire Border Town. This year's winter was completely different than the previous years. In the previous years, when the months of demons ended, Border Town's residents had to stay for one more month within Longsong's stronghold slums. They waited until the snow had completely melted. Only then would they head back home. Back at the town, they always saw a complete mess. After a few months with no one taking care of the houses, some of which had already become dilapidated. Some of the less sturdy huts had been overwhelmed by heavy snow, and some of the townspeople's houses had been used by the demonic beasts as hiding place. Everything was broken and in disorder. For example, the cupboards and the tables were full of bite marks, and the remains of their meals still lay within the corners. Obviously, these houses had been used as shelter from the snow and as their lair. They often had to spend a week repairing the houses, replacing all the moldy furniture, cleaning out the lingering smell of rot, and so on. This was the procedure to which the residents were already accustomed to, but this year, it could even be said that Border Town seemed completely new. The snow was quickly swept away, and the prince provided to each family home's door a multicolored banner. From afar, the previously monotonous and dilapidated town had become colorful. When the colors mixed together, it looked like a sea of flowers. The castle also spread the news that on the first day after the months of demons, His Royal Highness would hold a grand celebration ball in the town square. Everyone was invited, and if that wasn't enough, no one had to pay a coin and would also be given free food. What is a ball? It is a social occasion that only the upper nobility was allowed to attend. The townspeople only knew of them from the stories of the influential, experienced, and knowledgeable merchants. Yet even then, they were never allowed to attend. If what the merchants had been telling them was right, then even with all their money, it still wouldn't be enough to receive an invitation. But now His Highness would allow anyone to attend? Your Highness, you wouldn't do that, right? Carter asked disapprovingly. There will be neither a band, nor will there be any lead dancers. So who will control the rhythm of the ball? Besides, in this kind of remote place, even the nobles aren't necessarily able to dance, so citizens will only mess everything up. During Carter's time in Graycastle, he had only ever attended one ball. It had been hosted by a marquis to celebrate the birthday of his daughter. The music played was graceful string music mixed together with passionate drum beats, while the dancing contained many rotations and tapings. But if the instruments were played individually, the ladies would dance to the melodious string music, while the men displayed afterwards a fast and powerful dance in rhythm with the sound of the drums. During breaks, attendants would shuffle through the crowd and hand out drinks and snacks. Up till the last song, the men still had time to find and invite their favorite woman to a dance, and if they were lucky, they would not only be rewarded with a dance, but also with some sort of romantic interaction. Carter sighed. Although he was still too young to invite his favorite girl, he could still remember the aftertaste of that elegant and romantic atmosphere. The nobilities are trained daily in maintaining their elegant demeanor. Can the villagers who had to instead fight with the demonic beast daily compare with them? God, he could not imagine such a scene within Border Town. Lead dancer? Yes, well, Roland had commanded the militia to remove the stone sculptures and the gallows from the town square. Iron Axe, and the militia member will take over that part. That Sandman? Carter was stunned. As the captain of the hunter team, and with his performance during the months of demons, Iron Axe had finally gained the recognition of the chief knight. Even his alien appearance wasn't mentioned any longer. However, the other one was still from the Moji tribe. How could he know the etiquette of the Kingdom of Graycastle? Yet Roland only mysteriously smiled and said, "Because I'm the one who is organizing the ball. It won't be the usual kind. You will understand it when you see it." He didn't have much preparation work to do. His biggest job was to remove the obstructions placed in the town square, and instead to put a pile of wood at the center. In addition, they had built tables out of stone, used to carry the barbecued food. Yes, this was the plan Roland had come up with, a combination of campfire with a wild barbecue. Roland had long thought about the problem. How to increase the people's sense of belonging to Border Town. After a long life working under their previous lord, the concept of status and nationality was set too deep within these rural and illiterate villagers. Only their property and the lives of their family were of their concern. The more backward the people were, the more short-sighted they would become. This was a law for the development of civilization. Civilization can only be as big as the greatest ideas of its people, Roland thought deeply. But this does not mean that lifting their spirits could be ignored, and this victory celebration was one of the methods he had figured out to transform their thinking. In fact, he found it hard to understand that there was no general celebration after the end of the months of demons. Facing the invasion from the demonic beasts once in a year was just like a natural disaster. To overcome such evil was naturally worthy of remembering. So he had decided to name the first day after the end of the months of demons as Victory Day, so that within all of the territory belonging to him, this day had now become a public holiday on which many kinds of celebrations were held. As long as he was able to do it for 3 to 4 years, this kind of celebration would become a tradition and would even later carry on without Roland. And with time, the people would gradually feel that their own and other people under the governance of the Lord was indeed differently. Even so, it wasn't noon yet. The square was still full of people. The members of the militia were lined around the pile of wood so that no other could come near it. It seemed that the free distribution of food was quite attractive. I think that at least half of the town's inhabitants had come, Roland thought. In the end, more than 1,000 people stood side by side, filling up the complete square beside the woodpile. There was no place for any other activities. He even discovered that some children had climbed up on the roof of the surrounding buildings so that they had a free look of everything. Since it was their first time with this celebration, there were still some shortcomings. Roland thought that it was now the right time to enter the stage and to hold his speech. This was now his second public speech he had held on this square. Thanks to this, his attitude was much calmer than the last time. My people, good afternoon. I'm the fourth Prince of Graycastle, Roland Wimbledon. He still used the same introduction as last time, but today its effect was completely differently than it was the last time. His voice hadn't fallen yet, but the crowd already cheered. Long live the Prince, His Royal Highness. Long live His Highness. Roland suddenly felt a kind of warmth spreading through his chest. This time, he hadn't arranged for any propaganda from his own people. So when he heard the spontaneous cheers from his own militia and the townspeople, he felt a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction in his heart. When their voices finally calmed down a little, he continued, "The months of the demons is finally over. Thanks to the militia's heroic struggle, the demonic beasts weren't able to cross the wall one step. This year border town had only to pay a very small price to fight off the demonic beasts. This proves that, as long as we unite, even if we don't rely on the power of Longsong's stronghold, we can still get a foothold here. They wanted to threaten our town with food, the fear of hunger and cold, trying to force us to yield. But today's victory told them that all this was futile. Right, I do not want to go back to that place anymore. With His Royal Highness, we don't need to fear a day of hunger during the winter. At last they cannot blackmail us any longer. His Royal Highness is too kind. Let us celebrate this splendid and glorious triumph together," Roland shouted, taking advantage of the rising emotions within the crowd. "It is a day to be remembered, and I declare that from now on the first day after the end of the months of the demons will be known as the Victory Day. The celebration today is precisely for this purpose. My people, enjoy this day to the fullest. Now let the dance begin." With this, a torch was thrown into the pile of firewood. The flames jumped up, instantly setting the whole atmosphere on aflame. 6 marinated cattle were transported next to the bonfire by carts. If they weren't escorted by the militia, Roland suspected that on its way through the crowd, the whole cattle would have already been carved up by the masses. This was all of the food reserves the castle had left within the basement, so they wouldn't have any meat to eat until the arrival of the next merchant ship. Thinking of this, Roland's heart began to ache. In order to run this celebration, he had even used up all of the reserves he had. The master chefs brought over from Graycastle were only responsible for wiping the meat and controlling the heat. In the end, the task of barbecuing was handed over to 6 people from the militia team. An iron bar was inserted into the cattle's body through its mouth and then placed in front of the fire on a brick station. The flames were wildly burning, so that even separated by 2 to 3 meters, the heat waves were still clearly felt. Soon the whole cow's skin issued a sizzling sound. Oil began to emerge out of its pores. emitting a seductive scent. Of course, the barbecue couldn't be the only attraction. So on Roland's signal, Iron Axe together with a team of militia entered the stage. Since those gorgeous and complex court dance didn't apply to such an occasion, and there wasn't much time for training, they couldn't even remember all the essential steps, let alone show such a beautiful and complex dance. To ensure that it was an easy-to-understand dance which was still enjoyable, the dance of the Sand People was clearly more in line with the interests of the civilians. The dance started with Iron Axe and the others placing both of their hands on their hips, always putting the right arm through the partner's left arm, forming two rings around the bonfire. They were accompanied by the sounds of horns and began to move clockwise. With each step, they would throw the other foot to kick forward while shouting, "Ha! Is this the lead dance you talked about?" Carter asked, startled. "Can you even call this a dance?" Of course, it is very easy to remember. The militia had only needed to practice half an hour last night to master the pace. Roland answered laughingly. "Do you also want to try?" Carter shook his head and refused the offer. He just felt as if something in his heart would soon break out with a bang. Don't. She was just a girl with an appearance which made men's hearts beat faster. Don't. She is just a sad memory from my youth. The other militia members were clapping with their hands in the pace of all the dancers' footsteps, accompanying each round with faster applause. The extremely fast rhythm moved the masses. They one after another reached out with their own hands to clap in accordance. As the applause got faster and faster, Iron Axe and his team's dancing speed also became faster and faster. Soon the ring began to show signs of coming apart. It didn't take long until one of the dancers accidentally fell, taking more of the dancers with him. Seeing this, the crowd became shocked, but the militia did not stop the applause. Instead, it got wilder and changed into a storm. Iron Axe propped himself by a militia member, stopping his fall, and then he turned to the crowd and shouted, "Did everyone understand it? Who would like to try it themselves? Until you fall, just like us. If you join the dance, you can afterwards dive into the sweet and delicious honey barbecue. The longer you dance, the more meat you get." If the nobility or the rich families were to invite them, the normal townspeople would never have been involved, subconsciously giving them the feeling that they were superior compared to themselves. It was also common for the nobility to go back on their promises. But when they saw the militia members, which came from the usual crowd of civilians now beckoning them to dance with them, they were unable to hold themselves back. After the first round of people joined, they were soon followed by a second and then a third round. So soon, a new dance started, but this time most of the dancers came from the masses. Although this was a very simple interaction, it still made them very happy. In addition, with the reward of the honey barbecue in their sight, the participants tried their hardest to show the best possible performance. This was exactly the scene Roland wanted to see. In addition to the barbecue, there were also bread, fish cakes, and ale that was distributed to the masses. The celebration was planned to continue until evening, but Roland didn't plan to stay until then. He arranged for Carter to be in charge of the town square's safety, and the assistant minister was responsible for the closing speech. Then he left. He instead attended a private party at the castle's back garden. When the evening came, the backyard was still brightly lit. Just like in the town square, they had also started a bonfire. The difference was that they used chicken for the barbecue, which were cut into pieces. The seasoning and oil were of their own configuration, completely imitating the atmosphere of a barbecue in the wild. This kind of novelty of self-service style was loved too much by the witches that they could never part with it. Of course, for Roland's eyes, this was a rare spectacle. For example, Anna directly wrapped the chicken into her green flame after seasoning it, which soon gave off a delicious fragrance. Nightingale instead showed off her incredible knife work. One moment the knives were hidden, and a second later the chicken was hung upside down, completely peeled, and with all of its bones fell down. And of course, for the wine, it came from Willow Town and was much more suitable for the tastes of women than ale. Actually, Roland wanted to say that minors were prohibited from drinking, yet Lightning had already emptied half a bottle by herself, and since she was floating in the air, it would be difficult to persuade her, Roland thought. n/o/vel/b/gin.c//om. After around 1 hour within the barbecue, Roland was slightly tipsy. He leaned against a chair and watched the group of happy, laughing girls. Seeing this, Roland felt very pleased. This is the perfect life for a prince, he thought, and also for the witches. With their extraordinary abilities and appearance, they shouldn't be the object of hunting. If they were born in my previous life, I'm afraid they would have become the dazzling focus of many people. But now, here in my territory, they can live a normal life. At this moment, lightning suddenly fell down, directly landing on Roland's lap, and even before he had the possibility to react, she already had planted a kiss on his cheek. Although this action was done very quickly, it was still captured by many witches. When lightning grinningly flew upwards again, she could see that Anna, Nightingale, and Wendy looked very surprised, so she waved her hand, explained. According to the rules of the fjords, when they hold a banquet to celebrate a victory, the woman can take the initiative to kiss the leader. Dad would let me kiss him every time. Isn't this also a habit in Graycastle? Of course not. Roland instantly woke up from his half-drunken state. A cough, cough. Lightning, you're drunk. Quickly go back to the castle and sleep. How can that be? Lightning protested. When I was sailing, I had many drinking battles with the crew, and I never lost. Roland, recognizing that she would follow the order, turned to Wendy, who nodded and then used her power to kindly blow lightning to the earth. When lightning was close to landing, Wendy took 2 steps forward, approaching the girl and catching her within his arms. Disregarding of lightning's shouting and struggling, she walked in a straight line towards the castle. Don't worry about her. She just drunk too much. Please continue to celebrate. Soon the dessert will be delivered. Roland suddenly felt that the atmosphere had turned a little strange. Especially when he looked into Anna's eyes, he felt a chill rising up from his feet. The only one who was completely unaffected by what happened was Nana. She was still concentrating on eating her chicken wings, like nothing had happened in general. After the bonfire was gradually extinguished, Roland requested Nightingale to escort Nana home. Then he went to the well and washed his face with cold water, already ready to go to bed. Roland didn't take the former episode to heart. In his view, Lightning was still a minor child. But when he arrived at the 3rd floor, his heart suddenly begun to race. He saw Anna, who was leaning against his door. The corridor was shed by the moonlight which fell through the windows, yet only half of Anna's face was visible. Her eyes reflected the faint blue light, looking like 2 stars within the dark. Anna leaned against the door, with most of her body hidden in the shadows, but her outline was still visible. Good nutrition had completely changed her previous thin and skinny body, turning it into the body of an adult woman. Her body was just perfect, containing the right curves of her age, but also the unique charm of youth. Roland put on a calm face, stepped slowly forward until he was discovered by Anna. Finally, he stood in front of her, and they looked each other into the eyes. It was just an accident. I didn't know she would do, Roland began. I know. The other is still a minor, so I didn't care. This I also understood. NOV. L. B/JNN. Anna reacted completely differently than Roland had expected. It didn't seem like Anna was at odds with him. He couldn't detect any trace of displeasure on her face. There was only a serious look. There weren't any waves within her lake-like blue eyes. Roland realized that she was still a straightforward woman. She didn't like any camouflage and didn't need to hide anything. Sure enough, she took the initiative and said, I cannot be like lightning. In front of so many people, I don't dare to show such bold behavior, so I had to wait for you here. After this sentence, her cheeks gained a touch of blush, but even so, she didn't shrink back and her eyes were still focused straight on Roland's. Her look could even be said to be incomparably serious. For 2 beats, Roland's heart set out. He wanted to say something, but he felt that at the moment, everything he could say would be meaningless. She may mind the action of lightning, but grieving or complaining wasn't her way of acting. She would simply express her own feelings. Upright and hard-working children shouldn't be rejected, he thought. So Roland bent down, coming close to Anna's cheek, even feeling her breath on his face, like a spring breath fiddling his heartstrings. Within the quiet environment, they could clearly hear each other's nervous breathing. Then, soft lips slightly touched Roland's cheeks. Good night, Your Highness, Anna whispered. Asterisk. When he sat on the bed, looking at some books. For her, moments like this where she had leisure time were very rare. During her time in the Witch Cooperation Association, she also would have never thought about leading such a life. It wasn't long since she started staying within the town, but she had already developed the habit too. Before going to sleep, she would clean her body. And then she would put on a silk gown, which wasn't fastened around the waist, nor wasn't buttoned up. Sit cross-legged in the bed, with a soft pillow between her back and the wall, read books she had borrowed from His Highness. It had taken her a lot of time until she got lightning to rest, so afterward she did not intend to return to the back garden to continue the celebration, and instead she washed herself and went to bed. At the moment she was reading a history book about the origin of the church. Although she grew up in a monastery, yet this was a theme that she didn't know much about. The nuns had always warned them to obey the teaching of God, but they never mentioned God's name. During her childhood, this discrepancy had always puzzled her. Everything had a name, so why of all the things does the noblest God not have one? What was recorded within the books she had read and the rumors she had later heard told of basically the same thing. At the beginning of the history of the mainland, there were three major religions which thought of each other as heretics, believing that their gods were the only ones. This battle of faith lasted for nearly 100 years, and in the end, the church took the final victory. They declared that the other gods had been destroyed, and that calling God with any other name was forbidden. This was the word of God itself. The following pages describe the glory and immortality of the church, including the building of the old holy city and the new holy city, and their victory over the evil witches. To Wendy, this all seemed very strange. She had also borrowed the books, The History of the Kingdom of Graycastle and A Brief History of the Mainland from Roland. The first one almost unequivocally recorded the kingdom's establishment, development, and major events, such as the name of each king and the marital status and whereabouts of their children. The family with all their branches were described in such details that it nearly looked like a detailed genealogy. The Brief History of the Mainland focused more on the evolution of the four kingdoms, their alternations in handling their powers, and the inner and outer political struggles. However, they still put very much importance into the ruling families. Yet within the history book about the church, there wasn't mentioned any of the Pope's names. Or it could be said that it was the same thing they had done with God's name. They just replaced their former names with the title Pope. So throughout the whole book, it just looked like there was only one Pope during all of the hundreds of years of history. This wasn't consistent with common sense. Instead of calling it a record, it would be better to say it was a deliberate delusion. At this moment, Nightingale suddenly appeared within Wendy's room. When Wendy discovered her, she put down her book and looked at the other one with interest. "It's already so late, and you're only now free to talk to me?" Nightingale rubbed her tense neck and went to the bedside to sit down. "I just finished my job of bringing Nana home. How did you fare with lightning?" On the way, she was nonstop talking about her father. Yet when she hit the bed, she immediately fell asleep. I didn't even need to read some stories to her. Wendy shrugged. She always acts like she is already a big girl, but in truth, she is still a little child. "In your eyes, everyone is still a child," said the Nightingale teasingly, and took the book Wendy had previously in her hand. "His Royal Highness had said that you shouldn't read at night, especially that you shouldn't read when sitting in bed. The lighting isn't good enough and will hurt your eyes." "Yes, your Royal Highness did say that." The two of them talked for a long time. They talked about the time when they traveled together from Silver City to the impassable mountain range, what happened when they heard about a soon-to-killed witches, how they survived the months of demons. Nightingale had a lot to say, so much so that Wendy was only occasionally able to throw in one or two sentences. During the last 5 years, these two were so inseparable that they had developed a tacit understanding between each other. So the time passed slowly until finally the candles were about to extinguish. Seeing this, Wendy began to laugh and asked, "How is it? Can't you sleep because of lightning's actions today?" "What are you talking about? What else can it be?" Wendy smiled and shook her head. "Veronica, we are witches. You should know what that means." Nightingale kept silent, and even after a long time she didn't know what to say. Well, this fate, there was no which who could escape it. Wendy put away her smile, sighed, and then said, "Roland Wimbledon is the kingdom's 4th prince, and we have to do everything possible to ensure that he will take over the throne. Then when he rules the kingdom, he will be able to present us sisters with a shelter against the church. But that would also mean that he has become the king, and then there will come the time where he has to marry a duke's daughter or the princess of another kingdom. Then they will get children, maybe one or several. If it's a boy, he will inherit the country, and if it's a girl, she will be married off to another noble family. Here Wendy paused for a moment, giving Nightingale time to prepare, since she had to say words, which no witch wanted to hear. Veronica, we are witches. Witches cannot give birth to children. Even with the most optimistic outcome, where there is no difference between ordinary people and us witches, where we can freely walk along every road through the kingdom even after the death of His Highness, with occasional cases of outstanding witches gaining the right to enter the upper ranks of society, maybe even get canonized as nobles. There will still always be the case that we witches will never be able to have any descendants. And without any descendants, we are unable to continue the family's glory, so the nobles won't even consider marrying any witch. So we will gain some things, but at the same time, an important part will be taken from us. This is our fate, she whispered. I wish I didn't need to tell you this. I see, Nightingale whispered. With this, our service period is over, right? Asked Cat's Paw, who was clearing the square of the burning debris of the bonfire, and then continued with a voice full of regret. I really don't want to go back to the mines and work in a hole. I have to say, I already missed the months of demons a little. Yeah, and I don't want to deal with those stones again, either. Jop immediately agreed. The most important thing is that the difference in salary is too much. When we were assigned to the artillery, we had meat every day and a salary of 15 silver royals each day. Don't say such foolish words, said Vanner while holding a torch high to illuminate the surrounding. His Highness provided all this food to us so that no person would starve to death during the months of demons. You only need to remember what happened the previous 2 years. Not even half of the people from the old district were able to survive. Did you already forget this? I'll say it once more. It's unlikely that the team will be dissolved. His Highness just put us into the artillery team and burned so much gunpowder to train us. Do you think that was all without reason? But the month of demons is over. So, why would His Highness still need the artillery? Asked Rodney while leaning on a broom. That's because the artillery isn't meant for the demonic beasts, Vanner thought. But in the end he said out loud, soon we'll know more. Tomorrow we'll hear the answer. He yawned and waved his hand impatiently. Okay, enough. Quickly clean everything up. I'd like to go back to bed soon. The next morning, the teams were assembled and Vanner's previous statement was confirmed. When everyone was there, Iron Axe went in front of the lined-up team and said loudly, You have completed the first stage of the task, which was to defend Border Town against the demonic beasts. After 3 months and 6 days of fighting, you all earned His Highness recognition. Because of this, the militia will be promoted to His Highness regular army. But in case you don't want to fight any longer, you just need to stand up and leave now. His Highness had said that everyone who leaves now will get all of your outstanding payments, an additional payment of 25 silver royals as. Iron Axe had to think for a moment. Then he said, Right, retirement fee. From the 300 militia members, no one moved. Only the Cat's Paw raised his hand and said, Report. This was also one of the odds rules the prince had introduced during the training. No one was allowed to whisper in private. If they wanted to say something, they had to shout. Iron Axe nodded. Speak. What do you mean by being promoted to the regular army? Do we become knights? Vanner couldn't stop himself from laughing, but he quickly set up a serious face again. Becoming knights? That would mean becoming part of the aristocracy, not only getting an estate and a squire, but also their own territory. By asking this question, he had really lost a lot of face for the artillery. No, answered Iron Axe, and began to patiently explain, obvious to him since he had also previously asked His Highness. The regular army is a professional fighting force, only established for the protection of His Highness and his territory. In other words, when miners work in the mine, you will be training. When the farmers harvest their wheat, you will be training. And when the merchants sell their goods, you are still training. All the training is to win all the future battles, just like you did against the demonic beasts during the months of demons. Then what is the difference between the regular army and the militia? Asked Cat's Paw. More frequent training, stricter training methods, and a greater reward. Report. Hearing all this, Rodney couldn't help himself and asked, What does a greater reward mean? Vanner sighed. Why was his group of young men so impetuous? But in all honesty, he would also like to know this answer. The regular army will get an officer-led structure, and soldiers who fulfilled their given task according to the previous plan during the battles will get the chance at a promotion, and soldiers who performed extraordinarily well, said Iron Axe, for example, could rise to my position. If this was what His Highness said, Vanner thought to himself, and this was the way they implemented, it would be better to not offend one's superior, right? He quietly looked around. It seemed that no one realized the general problem. Instead, they still listened with keen interest and pleasure. Officers won't only get a higher payment, they will also get their own territory. After the last word fell, the crowd burst into an uproar. Vanner was also no exception. He even had doubts if he heard everything right. If they could get their own territory, then would there be any difference between them and the knights? But remember that once you choose to become a member of the regular army, the system you will follow then will be completely different from the system you are used from the militia. Such as in the case you aren't able to complete the given task, escape, start a rebellion, or any other violation of the disciplinary codex will be severely punished. This isn't like the previous punishment of not getting an additional egg to eat. Instead, it includes extra labor, imprisonment, and even hanging. Also, every previously awarded position can be taken back. Iron Axe paused for a moment. Now is your time to quit. The crowd fell into silence, and also Iron Axe tensed up, but still no one moved. He couldn't help himself. He began to grin. Well, then from today on, you all are placed directly under His Royal Highness Roland Wimbledon's orders. Vanner himself felt incredible. If he had heard these terrible punishments 3 months ago, he would have slipped away long ago. What is the use of promotion? What is the use of owning one's own territory if you aren't able to save your own life? But now, he almost did not hesitate to choose the fixed position, compared with returning to the North Slope mine to collect gravel, or to stay in the old district only able to wander idly around. It was clear which was much more to his interest. Your perception is pretty good. What's your name? Mr. Vanner, I hope you continue to do well. His Royal Highness encouraged him to train hard, and he also reaffirmed his idea that he belonged to the militia, and now Vanner would continue to fight for His Royal Highness as a member of the regular army. NOVLB //JNN. Iron Axe quickly announced today's first training program, field training. At the beginning, Vanner felt very disappointed. It was once more running for training. Even during the months of demons, if the weather was good enough, they always had to run. After breakfast, they checked the weather conditions, and then they had to run 2 laps around the town unless there were large snowflakes falling from the sky. Then they would abort running training. According to the saying of His Highness, this exercise was good for the muscles and allowed their bones to thaw, so while defending the city walls their movements wouldn't become stiff and unable to use the pike. But when the soldiers ran out of border town, Vanner immediately felt the difference between this new and the old training program. At this point, the snow on the field was still far from melting. After 3 months of uninterrupted snowing, the snow reached up to their knees. Calling it running wasn't the right word. Instead, it was better to call it crawling through the snow. The team suddenly broke into many small groups. After each step, they needed a lot of strength to take another step. There was no doubt that this special training of struggling through the snow was certainly an idea of His Highness. Vanner had already figured out the goal of His Royal Highness. At this moment, any protest would become invalid. They were only able to go through with this training until the end. During the whole morning, they had to struggle through the snow. So when the team returned to the town, Vanner was satisfied that he couldn't feel his own legs any longer. The snow which got into their boots had already turned into water. Even standing in the sun, most people were still cold and trembling. The huge physical exertion exacerbated the chill. Even Iron Axe felt unable to eat. He announced the dissolution of the team and delayed the lunchtime for 30 minutes so that everyone could dry their boots and replace their pants. So everyone was very pleased when they later heard that the afternoon training was canceled. Of course, they didn't know that Lightning had supervised the whole field training. This was the little girl's daily training regime, learning to precisely control her magic to fly with uniform velocity. When she later reported her gathered information to Roland, the latter nearly fell from his seat. The total distance traveled throughout the morning was 4 kilometers. A few days after the victory celebration, Roland finally undertook the great farming project. A constant dripping sound could be heard from the direction of the windows when he was sitting in his office. It sounded as if it was raining nonstop. It was the sound of the melting snow. When he visited the countryside for New Year's, he laid in front of the window most of the time, watching the long ice prisms which hung under the roof turn transparent and then into droplets, which then fell down. At the moment, he hadn't had the time for such leisure. However, writing down plans for the future while simultaneously listening to the voice of Earth's recovery was also very pleasurable. According to the information gathered from the previous years, the snow would need about 1 week's time to melt, but the road between the border town and Longsong stronghold would at least need 1 month until it was usable again. It took so much time after the snow melted since the road was built out of mud and also didn't have a drainage system. Roland could already imagine it. If he wanted to defeat Longsong stronghold, the first thing he needed to do was to build a road between the two cities which was usable by carriages even during heavy rains. But now the problem with the highest priority was still the issue of the army's reconstruction. Without a reliable and mighty army, it would be impossible to defeat the forces of the Longsong stronghold with his outnumbered troops. Transferring the militia into the regular army was only the first step. The specific preparation of establishing the new rules, discipline, reward, and punishment system turned out to be a big headache. Although as a child he had played land battle chess, however, he had already long forgotten all the previous teachings. Roland, after some thought, simply decided to make up his own plans. Anyway, as the creator of the new army, even if he implemented unreasonable things, no one would discover it anyway. So Border Town's first compilation for the new army was soon prepared. According to the army, division, platoon, team, squad, 5 people for a squad, taking into account that a cannon needed at least 5 people to operate, 10 squads for a team, 10 teams for a platoon. As for the number of platoons within a division, he decided to consider it later. In view of the overall battle prowess of the armies during this era, as long as he sent out 2 or 3 platoons of soldiers, it should be enough to defeat the vast majority of opponents on the battlefield. When he decided on the basics for the army framework, Roland took a deep breath. The rules and regulations that came next were much simpler. In addition to always wearing their uniform, they had to obey the commanding officer, never desert, never betray a comrade, and so on. Roland's first rule was to prohibit plundering and harassing. The problems caused by plundering were numerous, and the negative impact it had on the local inhabitants was so great that they would need years to recover, if ever. This was also the reason why he had insisted on only using civilians as the members of the military. When the aristocracy responded to the call for battle of their lords, the main reason for their obeying wasn't to defeat the enemy. Instead, it was for the looting afterwards. Or in other words, the main reason they followed the call of war was to plunder the wealth and territory of an enemy. Of course, this included also the innocent civilians within that territory. As for the mercenaries, not to mention bandits, even though they looked steady and fierce, but if you took a closer look, they were just a flag waving in the wind, and at the same time robbery was also a major source of their income. So hoping for military discipline from these people was meaningless. Only an army built up out of civilians wouldn't see other civilians as only lambs to be slaughtered. Of course, relying on discipline and moral restraint alone wasn't enough. After long days in the field, the heart of greed would enlarge with each continued victory. Therefore, the given rewards had to always keep up with the greed. Only in this way could he prevent looting and other illegal behavior. In order to make the reward grand enough, Roland decided to offer the greatest reward of all, receiving their own territory. As long as they achieved great merits during battle, they could get their own territory. Roland had many unclaimed territories. Like this, the land between Border Town and Longsong Stronghold could slowly be reclaimed. Since more than 90% of all land belonged to members of the aristocracy, such a reward was absolutely very appealing. Once they had their own property, these people would be closely attached to his side, and in case there was someone who wanted to overthrow him, they would show the strongest possible resistance to protect their benefactor, and with this protect their own land as well. After all, humankind wasn't driven by words and whips, but by their own benefits. Putting it another way, as long as he could continuously fulfill the basic interests of the people under his rule, there would be no one who could shake his dominance. Unlike a traditional fief, Roland will grant them an area between a few acres and up to a dozen acres. The territory could be used to build their own residences, and they could purchase serfs or hire farmers to take care of their fields, but they weren't allowed to set up their own industry. In contrast, the rewarded territory for a knight is close to 2,000 acres, an area equivalent to a small village. The above-mentioned industry income was used to provide the knight and his attendants for their war necessities. For example, it was needed to purchase their own weapons, armors, and horses. Being awarded such a small area of land wasn't of much interest to the aristocracy, and as such wouldn't encounter much resistance, but it would also weaken the feeling of independence for the people on the battlefield. In Roland's view, it was just like paying a retirement pension, which would ensure that the soldiers had a stable income even after retirement. At the same time, in order to strengthen the centralization of power, and to avoid that the thought that servant is not my servant would occur, he would only grant them the ownership of the territory, but no autonomy. In other words, the land was still under the jurisdiction of the laws, regulations, and systems in the Lord's area. In a sense, they would become the foundation for the future generations of farmers. After he had written down the concept for the reward system, Roland took a break and stretched his body. Then finally he could start thinking about a field within his own area of expertise, R&D weapons. N/O/vel/b/in.c//om. With the increasing speed of flintlock manufacturing, continuing to use spearmen to protect the gunners seemed to be a waste of manpower, so the latter needed the ability to fight independently in melee combat. There was a very easy solution to this problem, that was adding a bayonet to the flintlock. Roland didn't expect his own men to take the initiative and engage in close-range combat. Instead, they should only have the ability to defend themselves in case the power of the gun wasn't able to completely destroy the enemy's courage, and they started a desperate attack. A weapon like a bayonet wasn't so difficult to manufacture. Describing it in easy-to-understand words, it was just a sharp cone, and in the case of further improving the killing effectiveness, he could also add a blood groove into it. The key part was the connection between the bayonet and the gun. The first bayonet was a blade which was connected to a thin wooden pole, which could be directly put into the barrel of the gun. The advantage of this construction was that it was quite simple. The disadvantage was also very obvious. If the bayonet was used, the gun was unable to fire. And in addition, if it was used to stab someone, it could happen that the bayonet would become stuck in the enemy's body. So Roland intended to produce the improved second-generation bayonet, the casing-type bayonet. The bayonet had an iron casing added to the blade's handle. The inner casing diameter was slightly larger than the grooved barrel. One only needed to weld a piece of iron with a hole on top of the barrel. After plugging the bayonet on top of the barrel and inserting a filling into the hole, it would become fixed. The blade had a triangular form, with 3 sharp blades. If pierced into the body, it wouldn't fall off, and it would also leave a difficult-to-heal wound. After the installation of the bayonet would be slightly longer than the barrel, and so also complicate the loading process, but compared to a folding bayonet, it was much simpler for mass production. As long as there was a sample, any blacksmith was able to reproduce it. But to enable the bayonet to play an important part in a battle, it was important to train the soldiers in how to use it. But Roland naturally didn't know anything about it. Fortunately, he remembered that his chief knight had once boasted that he was able to use any weapon. So he just had to find him and get him to teach the others how to fight with a bayonet. The artillery production was also advancing steadily. The second round of production for the cannons had already entered the drilling phase, while the third round was still at the material collection phase. If he is lucky, Roland could have a gorgeous lineup of 4 12-pounders after a month. There was no doubt of his superiority in terms of firepower. But the question now was, how could he turn this advantage into a winning situation, and Roland was still striving for an answer to this. Before he crossed over, he was just working as a mechanical dog. And just like for most of the other people in that world, his understanding of war had only come from history, movies, and games. If it was just a battle with cold weapons, he could have handed over the command to Carter and Iron Axe. But this battle wasn't the same as those two had previously fought. There was no one who would be able to understand these new hot weapons better than himself. That being the case, he could only gather the knowledge they had and build his own plans on that foundation in addition to his knowledge from a later era. In order to ensure his victory, Roland let lightning travel every day between Border Town and Longsong's stronghold. On one hand to observe the road's conditions, and on the other hand because he needed to accurately calculate the distance. Roland believed that the victory in war was built on a foundation of previous gathered information and calculations. Whether it was a tactical development or the deduction of each stage of a battle, receiving victory in a battle was inseparably linked to these 2 points. Roland once more took the 1-meter-long iron pipes and the 100-meter-long hemp ropes he'd made for determining the firing range of his cannons. Then he went to the artillery testing area west of Border Town and measured with them a distance of 1 kilometer. Then he let lightning fly this distance so that she would always do it in the same amount of time. When she had skillfully remembered exactly how much magic to use, Roland began to measure the distance between the Longsong stronghold and Border Town. Using a sundial to measure the time that was needed for a round trip, he had calculated the distance between the 2 places was around 55 kilometers. Of course, this was the linear distance between 2 points. In fact, if traveling by land, you would need to take 2 big bends in order to avoid crossing over the foothill of the impassable mountain range. So in the case that the Duke chose to attack by land, he would need at least 3 days to reach Border Town. With lightning as a scout, Roland would be able to always have a clear idea where the enemy was and what he had to do. Within the range of 2 kilometers to the west of Border Town, he had inserted many signal flags to signal the distance, so if the enemy entered this area, his artillery could quickly adjust the muzzle angle without the need of firing a test shot. Now he began to worry what to do if the other party didn't start an attack. At this moment, a knocking sound came from the door. Nightingale, who had been lying all the time on the couch, chewing dried fish slices, vanished. Seeing this, Roland coughed twice and said, "Come in." The door opened, and his assistant minister, Barov, stepped in. "Your Highness, a member of the aristocracy of Longsong's stronghold want to see you." "Who?" asked Roland, only to directly ask once again, "Did they send that ambassador again?" "No, not the ambassador." Barov shook his head. "It is one of the nobles who left before the beginning of the months of demons, Baron Cornelius, who's came back now." Roland had to think a moment until he remembered that indeed there were nobles living in Border Town that had escaped to the stronghold. But now they dare to come back? They immediately return when spring starts. Doesn't they respect the royal law? Why does he want to see me? During the construction of the wall, his house was demolished, said the assistant to the treasurer. "If you don't want to receive him, I could send him out." Roland wanted to take him up on his offer, but then he changed his mind. "Let the Baron wait for me in the parlor." Maybe through him, Roland could put some pressure on Longsong's stronghold. At least this was something he would like to happen. After dawdling for around half an hour, Roland leisurely entered the parlor. After arriving, he saw a man with a very round belly impatiently waiting beside the long table. While the man restlessly walked up and down, the additional layers of meat on his face swayed in accordance with his steps. Seeing that his Highness had finally appeared, the Baron stopped his walking and reluctantly went through the royal greeting ceremony. "Sit down." Roland went to the table and placed himself in his seat. According to his usual habits, even if it wasn't time for dinner, he would let his kitchen at least prepare a dessert, but today he did not even let them prepare tea. "Your Highness, Prince," murmured Cornelius, and started speaking even before he sat. "How could you let that stupid stonemason take my house apart? That was still a good house. From the parapet, the logs used for the roof beam column was also of the best quality. When I had it built, I had to spend more than 150 gold royals." While speaking, he agitatedly waved with his hands. N/O/vel/b/in.c//om. 150. Hearing this, Roland had to use a lot of strength to suppress his laughter. If it was still the prince from before, when looking through the old memories, maybe I really would have believed that. But now, you mean the house located the furthest to the west? "Well," said Cornelius while nodding, "it was the grand mansion, second only to Baron Simon's. It's such a pity that it was located too close to the wall and had hindered the passage of my men, Roland said, after stopping for a moment. Then he continued, but the town hall had already decided on the compensation. How much? Roland stretched out 2 fingers. 20 gold royals. That's too little? Your Royal Highness, shouted Cornelius while spraying spittle everywhere. Eventually, he calmed down. Then he took out his handkerchief and wiped the sweat from his forehead. Well, 20 gold royals. Where should I go get the money? Get? Roland put on a puzzled look. The money has already been paid to the owner of the house. What? Wait. I am the owner of that mansion. It's not you. It's Blair, the captain of my 2nd militia. Who is that? The Baron asked once more in a loud voice. Your Highness, you are mistaken. I am the master of the house. But I didn't see you during the winter. Roland picked up his brow. How then can that house be yours? Of course I wasn't there. I went back to the Long Song stronghold. Who would stay in this god-forsaken place? This place is only able to be used as a feeding ground for the demonic beast. So you want to say you fled because you feared the demonic beasts? And you still have the face to call yourself a lord? Asked Roland. The Baron was suddenly stunned and didn't know how to reply. Guards, Roland clapped his hands, and immediately 2 guards came into the parlor, holding Cornelius between them. We're in the palace, hello. What do you mean with this? Very simple. You now have 2 choices. Roland stood up from the seat, freezing Cornelius with his look. First, you admit that you've wronged, that the house doesn't belong to you. And then I can look at what happened just now as nothing more than a farce. Your second option is admitting that during the months of demons, you betrayed your lord, fleeing from the battle without the permission of your lord, shamefully escaping to Long Song stronghold. If you take this option, I will put you in prison for desertion, where you will wait for the day of your hanging. Which one do you choose? The sweat pouring from Cornelius' forehead didn't stop. He swallowed in fear, hesitated for a moment before he quivered. Your Highness, I made a mistake. It was not my house. So this was all a misunderstanding. Roland shrugged and then said to the guards, send the Baron on his way. When Cornelius was nearly through the door, the prince stopped him once more. Right, when you take your ship back to the Long Song stronghold, can you please deliver a message for me? Tell those, who have maybe the same misunderstanding as yourself. In case they don't want to choose the second option, they don't need to waste their time by coming to Border Town. Anything you want, Your Highness, Cornelius said with a forced smile while leaving the room. But the moment he turned around, Roland could see how his counterpart was gnashing his teeth. Like this, I ought to have created a big enough uproar within Long Song stronghold, right? Roland thought. Damn, what a bullshit prince. Isn't he the one who was only thrown into this wilderness out of pity? Cornelius ferociously thought. But when he remembered the 2 guards with their hands at their swords who were walking behind him, he had to temporarily swallow his mouthful of resentments back into his stomach. When he was finally out of the castle and saw the 2 guards leaving, the Baron felt relieved. He pulled out an already wet handkerchief and wiped his forehead. He resolutely spit out a mouth full of spittle, while imagining the spit directly smashing into the prince's face. Yet this still wasn't enough to release his anger, so he had to stamp repeatedly onto the spit until his heart was finally comforted. Just because you were able to block the invasion of the demonic beasts, you think that you are able to face up against Long Song stronghold? Just carry on being so proud. After all, you don't have much time left in which to be so proud. Cornelius thought that if he hadn't received such reliable information, he would never have dared to come back to Border Town so early. In general, the aristocracy will always return even later than the civilians. After all, mining and hunting was dirty work. It was so hard that the aristocrats would never do them. Their part was just to supervise the production and wait until there was enough or so that it could be transferred. And in their spare time, they would go to their hunters' houses and ask whether they had any suitable high-quality fur to purchase. But this year the situation was completely differently. Cornelius had heard from the financial director, Sir Reynolds, that Duke Ryan was ready to drive the 4th prince out of Border Town. This wasn't a betrayal to the King of Graycastle. No, instead, they were upholding an order from Timothy Wimbledon, the new king. Roland Wimbledon is no longer the lord of Border Town, and if he wants to get reassigned to a new territory, he has to return back to the king's office first. Duke Ryan had spoken these revolutionary words in front of Sir Reynolds, who had been able to climb up from a position in the city hall to the position of financial director in only 5 short years. If they hadn't had a distant relationship as relatives, and if he hadn't sent him 2 high-quality furs each year, Cornelius would never be able to know what went on in the minds of the people in charge of the West. Gaining a new territory after returning to the king was just an empty statement. Even Cornelius knew that the first prince, without being able to say anything, had been sent to the guillotine. So if the 4th prince went back, would the new king show him mercy? Without doubt, the west border was under the rule of Duke Ryan. The only question was whether he would wait for the order of King Timothy or if he would act without it. However, when Duke Ryan decided to act, there would be no difference between Roland Wimbledon and a homeless dog. This was also the reason why Cornelius had rushed to Border Town. The first reason was naturally to get to the furs as early as possible, but his second reason was to put his own house up for sale. The first point he thought was a very smart idea. While in the previous years the civilians fled to the Long Song stronghold to take refuge, their inventory was naturally empty so early in the year. But this year they had stayed the whole time in Border Town. Surely there were some goods he would receive, right? So not only could he make a small fortune, but he could also offer Reynolds some familial piety. The second point was that Cornelius had asked Reynolds to give him a place within the city hall, although it was just busy work, but it was still better than living in this damn poor place. And since he wouldn't need his house any longer, he should sell it as soon as possible. Who knows when Duke Ryan would start his attack? Maybe this unruly mercenary would raid and burn his house, giving him a big loss. But he never imagined that the house wasn't burned down by mercenaries, but instead it was directly removed by the 4th prince. When the Baron thought once more about this fact, he gritted his teeth in anger. It was one of my best houses, although 150 gold royals were an exaggeration, but it had at least a value of 30 gold royals. In order to get the money early, he had even bent his back and had reluctantly accepted 20 gold royals, but then His Highness even treated him in such a crazy way. Instead of giving him his coins, he was even threatened by defection. Doesn't he know that each year to the beginning of the months of demons, all the nobles evacuated towards Long Song's stronghold? Wait a minute. Cornelius suddenly slowed down. There seemed to be something wrong. Although he had previously heard of the 4th prince's bad character, the prince was always acting without thinking. He even maliciously molested Baron Simon's wife directly after he had arrived at Border Town. Afterwards, this became a private joke for a long time. But today, the impression he received from the prince didn't match with what he knew. The prince had never become angry, nor did he act shamelessly. Instead, it was Cornelius himself who had shown bad character and acted completely without rhyme or reason. During the whole talk, the other side had constantly spoken in the same tone. So why had he become so scared, even having obediently giving up his own house? If he had said that the house was his own, would the prince really have killed him, or not? Right? Cornelius couldn't help himself from shuddering, sweat on his forehead shrinking back. Now, in retrospect, when he'd faced the prince, he'd had the illusion that he was instead talking with Duke Ryan. The Baron shook his head hard, trying to search through these unpleasant memories at the back of his mind. Anyway, the 4th prince will only be proud for a few days longer. Soon Duke Ryan will bring Border Town back under his rule, and then His Highness Roland Wimbledon will also be escorted back to Graycastle. I will have a good laugh at him then. Perhaps those 20 gold royals were lost, but in the end Duke Ryan will still seek out revenge for myself. Stopping his thinking here, he was finally able to relax again. Since he had received some high-quality pieces of fur, and he didn't need to sell his house any longer, he could simply sail back to Long Song's stronghold now. Delivering the message to the member of the aristocracy who had the same misunderstanding simply has to be a great act. When I return to Long Song's stronghold, I have to imitate it as good as possible so that everyone knows what a bluff looks like. When he finally left the castle area, walking down the road to the harbor, Cornelius passed a woman who was wearing a hood. Originally, there was nothing strange about it. After all, the townspeople were coming and going all the time, but the woman was all dressed up. Maybe she was a young lady or an upper-class woman, on her way seeing the prince. But when a gust of wind blew up the corner of her hood, Cornelius felt his heart jump, and he couldn't catch his breath. God, That's what a woman should look like with rare green long hair. Even just revealing a part of her face for a moment was enough to get me stunned. Even if the king in Graycastle called for the princesses of other aristocracy, he wouldn't see someone like her. So how is it possible that someone so beautiful is in Border Town? n/o/vel/b/jen.c//om. He turned around, wanting to catch up with her, seeing what she would do, only to discover that she was walking straight into the direction of the castle. Is this the kind of woman the prince has access to? The Baron hesitated a bit longer, but in the end he gave up. He just really didn't want to have anything to do with the fourth prince. Such a wicked person should be left for Duke Ryan to clear up. I still have to get back to Longsong's stronghold. Arriving at the pier, he entered his own single-masted clipper. The boatman pulled at the sail, and the boat quickly left the pier, sailing in the direction of Longsong's stronghold. On the way back, while sitting in the sun, Cornelius saw quite the spectacle. About 5 miles away from Border Town in a field of snow, a large group of people entered his field of vision. They were all wearing the same brown leather armor and long wooden pikes on their back. Forming a long line, they slowly marched through the snow. Although he was separated from them by a small forest so that he couldn't clearly see everything, he was still sure that there was at least 100 people. Those are the farmers the fourth prince used to confront the demonic beasts. In the early months of the year, when the snow still covered the roads, it was absolutely difficult to walk in the snow. Cornelius couldn't even imagine it. But the group of people were still moving down the road, and it even looked as if the snow was at least 1 foot deep. This wasn't a small matter. He wanted to laugh at the ridiculous sight, only to discover that he was unable to. A feeling of doubt unconscionably arose in his heart. The knights under Duke Ryan's command, would they also be able to do this? Liv saw that there were people busy everywhere. She had never thought that she would ever return to a town in the secular world. After crossing the border of Border Town, one-story brick buildings which were covered in dust appeared one after another in front of her. Even though it was only half a year since she had fled into the impassable mountain range, she still felt like she had just stepped into another world. The months of demons just came to an end, so after passing the winter the townsfolk were short on food and clothing, and the complexion of their bodies should be very bad. At least this was what Leaves remembered when she had crossed the slums of Silver City and her journey to the west. Everywhere were people who died from the cold or from hunger. And if they were living, they still walked as if they were already corpses, with an empty gaze and a slow and unsteady movement. But here, most people she saw were full of vitality. Some were even drying fishes at the entryways of their houses. Some had climbed on top of their roofs to repair damaged tiles. Other young men were carrying hoes and hammers. They talked and smiled to each other while walking to the north of the town. To prevent other people from trying to talk to her, Leaves pulled her hat down as far as possible. The castle stood at a very striking area. It was placed at the southwest corner on top of a hillside. There was no plants around her, so if she wanted to sneak into the castle, it was quite difficult. Hiding herself in the trunk of a tree would be okay, but letting it stand up and walk would be too much. For a witch, she really wasn't good at hiding her body. So after carefully considering her options, Leaves thought that rather than hiding herself, she wanted to walk openly into the castle. If Nightingale didn't lie to her, then even if she entered through the main entrance, she wouldn't face any problems. And in case Nightingale deceived her, deceived the Witch Cooperation Association, she was also self-confident enough that she would be able to flee from the 2 guards at the entry. Of course, there was also the worst-case scenario, that Nightingale had betrayed everyone and there weren't any witches working for the prince. If that was the case, she would in all likelihood die. As a top fighting witch, very few people would be able to escape if Nightingale wanted to kill them. She was probably even stronger than Kara. If they fought each other, it wasn't certain who would win. Leaves had already prepared herself for the worst case. If she was unable to come back, Scroll would take over the position as mentor and lead her last sisters into their future. No matter where their destination laid, no matter where at which place they ended, no one knew the answer. She slowly walked up the hill, coming close to the castle's gate, and was soon noticed by the guards, who put their hands on the hilt of their swords, and one loudly snapped, "This is the prince's palace. It's no place for you. You should quickly go back." He paused, and then added, "If there is something important you have to report, go straight to the left and follow the street until you reach the town's hall. There are people who will receive you." Leaves took a deep breath. Then she took off her hood. Not surprisingly, she saw a surprised look on their faces. When she saw that the other side had recovered their feelings, she bluntly said, "I am a witch." At the moment she said the sentence, she almost expected the other side to draw their swords. Yet the two guards just stared at each other. There was no ordinary man who could hide their feeling of disgust when they heard she was a witch, but their faces showed only curiosity. One of them even asked with interest, "You are a witch? What ability do you have?" Hearing their response, Leaves' heart begun to beat faster. She was almost unable to hold her excitement back from breaking out. While trying to keep her voice calm, she said, "I want to see Nightingale. Anna or Nana would also be okay." In Nightingale's story, the witches were frequent visitors to the castle. The prince didn't restrict their freedom, only acting as their guardian, even letting them come and go as they pleased. But if Nightingale's story wasn't true, the guards surely had never heard of their names. One guard turned to his partner, the one who had previously spoken out loud, patted his shoulder, and said, "You will keep her here, and I'm going to inform His Royal Highness." Leaves watched him walk through the gate, soon disappearing in the direction of the garden. While waiting for what would happen now, she thought about the probabilities. In the end, would Nightingale greet her like a sister, or were the guards at this moment surrounding her? Or would she be attacked by a blade out of the shadow? She found herself in a strange contradiction. Obviously, she wanted to believe in Nightingale, but the closer she came to the answer, the more afraid she became of the thought to get disappointed. Maybe Nightingale was a secret agent? The names of Anna and Nana weren't made up by her, right? Or, for her, the time had never passed slower than at this moment. Every heartbeat was like 100 years for her. For her, it was a very long time that she had to wait until her destiny was decided. In the end, she didn't know how long or how short the moment was she had to wait until she heard Nightingale's voice. As if in a trance, she was unable to do anything, only asking herself if she heard it right. A familiar figure emerged from the gate, bounced over, and reached Leaves' side almost at the same time as her voice. The next moment she was already wrapped in a warm hug. "Leaves, welcome home." Asterisk. "This is my spare uniform. For the moment you can wear it," said Nightingale, who rummaged through her cupboard. "Here is the jacket, shoes. Well, here's also a nightgown and bath towel. Why are you in such a hurry?" When he shook her head with a smile on her face. "You only have to wait until His Highness is up. Then she will get everything." Seeing how busy Nightingale was to help her, Leaves' eyes became warm. She took a deep breath, trying to suppress her tears. From the beginning, Nightingale had never lied to them. There really existed a prince who treated witches nicely. "Do you want to take a bath first?" asked Nightingale, and placed the towel and bathrobe directly beside her. "At the moment His Royal Highness is taking a nap. When he finally wakes up, he will gladly receive you. Right? Were you able to find the Holy Mountain? How did you and the other sisters fare? n/o/vel/b//jin.c//om." When this sentence was spoken, Leaves' line of sight became suddenly blurred. Unable to bear it any longer, she wrapped her arms around Nightingale, releasing the long-suppressed pain inside her heart. After having cried for a long time, Nightingale's chest had already become wet from the tears, but at least Leaves was finally able to calm down. Then she began to tell them what had happened after their last meeting, telling them all the suffering they had to bear. When it came to the point where her sisters were buried in the wild, she felt how Nightingale took her hand and squeezed it. When Leaves' story came to its end, Wendy's look became very heavy. "I had never expected that Kara would bring the Witch Cooperation Association to its end. From the 42 sisters, only 7 people. It was also my inescapable responsibility if I hadn't stood firmly on Nightingale's side." "It wasn't your fault," said the Nightingale sadly. "No one can predict the future. Now the important part is to decide what to do next." She looked at Leaves. "You said there were 6 other sisters who survived. Where are they now?" "They're at the entrance to the canyon waiting for a message from me. We previously made an appointment. If I'm unable to come back, Scroll will lead them away from here, maybe to the extreme south, perhaps even crossing the sea. Then we will have to go to the canyon and get them, said Nightingale, excited. I'll leave now. Wendy will stay here and take care of you. Wait a minute. What will you do if they don't believe you? Leaves will have to go with you. Just call Lightning to follow along. At the moment, she should be training for her flight towards Long Song Stronghold. Take some horses with you, like this. Our sisters can ride the last part of their road, Wendy carefully urged. But His Highness, isn't he still sleeping? Leaves became stunned. Don't you need to get his approval first? Rest assured, said Nightingale reassuringly, if His Royal Highness knew about this, I am afraid he would went crazy from waiting. When Roland walked into the office, he was surprised to discover that the one waiting for him wasn't Nightingale, but Wendy. What happened? He poured himself a cup of warm water. Where's Nightingale? She went to meet our sisters. Are you, Roland, having raised his cup, ready to drink, suddenly felt that something was wrong. Wait a minute. What sisters? Our sisters from the Witch Cooperation Association. They've come to Border Town, Wendy replied. Aren't they still busy looking for the Holy Mountain? He jumped to his feet. How many people are there? The one that wanted to kill Nightingale. I seem to remember she was called Kara. Is she also coming? No, Your Highness. They were unable to find the Holy Mountain. When they finally managed to enter the wildlands, they were attacked by terrible monsters. Ultimately, only 7 sisters survived. Wendy reported what Leaves had told her. Then she bowed to apologize. You were still napping. Please forgive us for deciding that Nightingale and Lightning should go and pick them up. No, Roland said while waving his hand in refusal. You already know that I won't blame you for what you decided. What are their abilities? This I don't know, but Leaves told us that they don't belong to the fighting type of witch. Perhaps, when he hesitated, they aren't of much use to you. Non-fighting type? Roland's heart was suddenly full of expectations. The Godstone of Retaliations and the witch's small area of effect drawback actually already limit the fighting capability of the witches by a lot. So production was their strongest field in any case. If there is a witch with the ability to produce plastics, I would be able to solve the problems of my rough processing technology. I could directly step into the mechanical production era. If they have a witch with an electrical ability with them, she would be able to turn the night into day for Border Town. If the next king took a witch as his bride, they would be able to lead us to the pinnacle of life. They could leading us to achieve Deng Xiaoping's 4 modernizations. Just thinking about these possibilities makes me already totally excited. n/o/vel/b/jin.c//om. Your Highness, if you don't need them, perhaps the silence was too long for Wendy, that she began to worry and so whispered. No, how could that be possible? Roland said, not letting her speak one word more. As many witches as arrive is as many I will accept. Around sunset, Nightingale returned smoothly with the last from the sisters from the Witch Cooperation Association. Roland, who was already waiting for them, had prepared a sumptuous dinner in the castle grand hall, trying to wash away the memories of the hardships they had encountered during their travels. The witches were obviously very hungry, but it was their first time dining in such a grand environment. They were all acting very reserved. For many of them, it was the first time seeing a lord, not to mention that this lord was even a prince of this country. Fortunately, in addition to Roland himself, there were also the 2 local witches, Anna and Nana, who demonstrated how to act, and not to forget there was also the lively Lightning. In the end, they were finally able to let go of their shyness and start to enjoy the banquet, even starting a happy conversation. Roland was chewing on a slice of bread. At the same time, he was also looking on with high spirit at the quite different styled women before him. Even with their uniqueness, they could all still be regarded as beautiful women. This was the great gift of magic. Even with the technology of the science in the future, those witches wouldn't have the need to use any of it. Even without cosmetic surgery, their appearance was still able to turn every head. Since Carl still wasn't finished with the construction of the living area for the witches, the only possibility was to place all of them inside of the castle. There were still 4 rooms vacant on the 2nd floor. So Roland considered changing the single-person rooms into double-occupancy rooms. After all, those big beds were actually prepared for visiting nobility. It could easily accommodate 2 people and still have room to spare. The prince waited until the end of the dinner and then finally asked the long-awaited question. What were their abilities? Like a wolf herding sheep, Nightingale brought them one after another into the office. There Roland asked all of them specific questions about their life and abilities, etc., all things that were comparable with a job interview. He recorded each of their characteristics. He also tested their abilities while being protected by the effect by a god stone of retaliation. When the last interview with the witches was finally completed, he took a deep breath and stretched out his tense body. If he wasn't afraid that Nightingale might be directly beside him, eavesdropping, he would have liked to start humming Superstar. Although there weren't any witches with the ability of electricity or shaping material, which could have been used to raise the slow modernization speed, but this batch of witches was still able to bring Roland an ample amount of pleasant surprises. First and most important of them was the witch called Leaves. He spread all the records he had collected over the table and took hers back into his hands. Prior to adulthood, Leaves was still only able to speed up the growth of plants and their fruits. But after her day of adulthood, her ability had greatly improved. Besides her growth control of plants, she could now also manipulate them. The first ability could be used to improve the quality of fruits and seeds, increase yield, and also increase their herbal effects. Her ability also had possibility of altering a plant's characteristics and traits. According to her explanation, if she put her magic into a plant, she was able to grow green leaves on a dead branch. While if she put her magic into weeds, she could wrap them around her enemy's feet, and doing so entrap them. But the most remarkable thing was that she was able to integrate herself into a tree. However, the bigger the plant, the more magic she had to spend to manipulate it. So she preferred using weeds during combat, as it showed a faster effect while having a lower cost. The range at which she was able to cast her power, even through physical materials, such as earth, was around 5 meters. There was no doubt that the witch whose ability resembled her name and whose green hair, also her appearance, would be a good helper to improve the agriculture. So her importance to Roland was self-evident. Industrialization required a large population, and if there was a large number of people, it also needed an adequate supply of food to support the population. This was achievable through either self-producing or through trade. If they used the former possibility and the production wasn't efficient enough, most of their human resources would have to go work in the fields. The second point was very difficult to achieve because of this era's ability to transport goods. Now that he was able to lay his hands on a druid, Roland hoped to use only a few farmers to feed a large number of the industrial population, and with this accelerate the process of industrialization in his territory. Therefore, in the future, he would let her practice improving the quality of wheat and barley seeds so that they would deliver a larger yield. As long as she only improved them by at least a little, it would still greatly help to improve his territory overall and raise the upper limit for the population. In addition, Roland had heard that the fjords also had some unique types of food. According to Lightning's description, it sounded like they had both potatoes and corn. If these rumors were true, then introducing those two plants as crops should become one of his highest priorities. After all, wheat itself wasn't a high-yielding crop. Roland carefully wrote down the future practice plan and then put Leaves' data aside, and then he drew the second piece of paper from the table. The second which he had interviewed was named Scroll. She was also the oldest witch within the 7 survivors. This year she was close to 40 years old. This was a really rare age for a witch. The older they became, the harder it was to resist the demonic bite. But when she described her ability to him, Roland could immediately understand why she had been able to reach that age. Her primary ability was having a much better memory than the ordinary person. Her memory has become so good that she could almost be regarded as already unable to forget anything. On her day of adulthood, she had also gotten a very interesting branch to her ability. She could read books and for a short period of time create a copy of it. Because of this, Roland named her ability the illusion of a book. Since she used her main ability almost all the time, Scroll could easily pass each day of awakening. This was also the reason why, even though she came from a very poor family, she was still so knowledgeable. This ability greatly enhanced her learning ability, especially for exercises where someone would need to remember important texts. Casting her branch magic was very taxing for her body. How long she could create a copy of a book was dependent on how much mana she had remaining within her body. Usually it was enough for 1 to 2 hours. Obviously, Scroll was a natural-born teacher. If in the future he wanted to increase the standard of education, she was a teacher who could teach nearly anything. Well, as for now, Roland thought her ability didn't offer much to practice, so he simply put her file to the side while thinking, when I have some leisure time, I can write some primary math and primary physics problems down to teach her, so that when the time is ripe, she will be able to enlighten the education sector. The name of the third, which was Hummingbird, she was a witch that had a small size, just like her nickname depicted. When asked to perform her ability, she had acted much more cautiously than the other witches had. It was just in this year that she had become an adult, had symmetrical dimples on her cheeks, and very delicate features with a waxy, soft voice. Summing it up, she was cute. Her ability was to lighten an object. When she put her magic into an object, its weight would be greatly reduced. According to her description, the weight would almost become close to zero. Roland let Hummingbird give him a live demonstration with her own cup, seemingly letting it float in the air. In other words, its weight was about equal to the air. Of course, in this era in the eyes of the people, the air had no weight. It seemed it was due to her ability that the Witch Cooperation Association was able to cross the impassable mountain range. With the help of this young witch, the bags could be filled up with the wheat and dried fish and were still easily to carry. Like this, only a few people had been needed to carry a lot of materials, which had significantly reduced the trouble with logistic. Although Hummingbird had already become an adult, but she still hadn't developed any branch magic. To cast her magic, she needs to be in contact with her target. In addition, the target wasn't allowed to be a living entity. The bulkier the object, the more time would need to transform its weight, and the more magic she would consume. However, once the conversion was completed, it would last for several hours. This capability looked to be very suitable for the transportation industry, and it also had some promising uses in the upcoming war. But there were still just too many unknown elements, so her abilities still needed to be more researched before that. Thinking all this trough, Roland wrote at the bottom of her parchment, learning to control the needed magic output by training with stones of different weights, so that in the end she can precisely determine the effective time of her magic. After finishing the first 3 training programs, he ordered his attendant to light another candle, making the room brighter. But even with this, in the waving orange candlelight, the reading and writing became much more tiring to his eyes. Roland yawned and took the parchment with information concerning the fourth witch. The fourth witch had a rare surname. With her full name, she was called Soraya Zoen. She belonged to a merchant family from Graycastle and had brown short coils and a pair of slender eyes. On top of her nose, she had a small freckle which didn't destroy her beauty. Instead, it gave her a unique touch of youthful vitality. She was 19 years old, and her ability was also very special. After all, she was able to paint a picture of everything she saw or could imagine. In addition, with her magic pen, which was her branch ability, she was able to draw without any paint on any paper, and it would be just like creating a photorealistic image. Her ability, which was just like a camera, had endless possibilities, and as for her training, he would just let her draw some paintings every day. Afterwards, he pulled out the next parchment, the fifth, which was called Echo, and was a woman from the extreme south. She was tall, had brown skin, and her eyes and nose had the typical southern features, giving her a very exotic look. According to her story, after her awakening, she was able to imitate any animal's call, and after her day of adulthood her calls had only gotten more wonderful and charming. She didn't develop any branch ability. Roland decided to name her ability Magic Sound. As for the long-time uses, he had no idea. Even for practice possibilities, she should just roar at the top of her voice as much as she wants. The sixth witch who came in to be interviewed was Lily, who was only 16 years old. She had 2 ponytails and a delicate doll-like face, without showing any facial expressions while sitting in front of Roland. Her ability was to prevent food from rotting. And even though her awakening had only been 1 year ago, she was still the witch with the most important role in the Witch Cooperation Association. Without any food preservation, a lot of food would have become inedible during their journey. Lily, together with Hummingbird, would be a good addition to his logistic force. As for how she kept the food fresh, whether she was killing the bacteria or had any other means was still to be confirmed. Roland decided to let her practice on all kinds of meat and fruits, and that she should also confirm her magic powers, time of duration ratio. He rubbed his tingling neck and put the information about the 6 witches on a pile and set them to the side. Now there was only one last piece of information on his table. After leaves, she was the next surprise for Roland. 7th witch, Mystery Moon. She was very nervous when she walked into the office. Nightingale even had to come in to comfort her for a while. Nightingale later whispered to Roland the specific reason why she was so nervous into his ear. Even so, her ability was still a mystery, yet it was known as the worst ability within the Witch Cooperation Association. It could even be said to be useless, since it was also easily accomplished by human labor. Coupled with often being blamed by Kara, she has become very timid, and now she feared that if Roland also thought that she was useless, he would ban her from Border Town. Her main ability was to magnetize an object. Before she reached her adulthood, she was only able to magnetize metallic objects, but afterwards she was able to magnetize any object she was able to put her hands on. She also didn't have any known branch ability, and the magnetizing process was also extremely slow. According to her story, it would take her half a day to magnetize a square stone block the size of about half a foot. This ability wasn't of much use to the Witch Cooperation Association. A magnet wasn't new to them. Every huge vessel sailing across the seas was equipped with a 6-point compass, so they could easily identify their direction. On the contrary, her magnetized objects were causing problems. For example, a metallic pot which was lightened by a hummingbird flew always in the direction of her magnetized objects. In the end, Kara even banned her from using her power. But for Roland, this taciturn girl was simply a priceless gift. She was also the reason why he wanted to hum Superstar. Was there anything more appropriate than the lyrics of "You are electric, you are light"? Magneto-electric, electromagnetism, was knowledge that any science and technology dog would know about. He thanked Faraday, Gauss, Ampere, and Maxwell wholeheartedly. With electricity, there also was light. Perhaps it wouldn't take him much longer until he will be able to show Border Town a new miracle. NOVLB //JNN. A witch who was forbidden from using power and was still able to survive the demonic bite showed that her self-esteem wasn't so fragile. At least her desire to live on was much stronger than of most other people. Roland was secretly overjoyed that she only joined the Witch Cooperation Association less than a year ago, or else over the years she would most likely have become a living ruin under Kara's rule. With much enthusiasm he wrote, "In the following days, Mystery Moon will magnetize a variety of items as training and determine the relationship between the consumption of her magic and the size she magnetizes." With the addition of these 7 new witches, Roland witch lineup had increased to 12. After seeing so many examples, Roland got a general understanding of magic. Their traditional classification of combat and non-combat type wasn't reasonable. Roland instead preferred to divide them by the characteristics of their magic abilities. Summarizing it, the witch's ability can basically be divided into 3 categories. The first category was the self-strengthening type. This type of ability seemed to be very rare. So far, only Scroll seems to belong to this category. Even under the effect of God's Stone of Retaliations, she still wouldn't lose her extraordinary memory. The second type was the summoning type. Anna, Nightingale, Nana, Lightning, Wendy, Leaves, Soraya, Echo, and Lily all fell into this category. Its characteristic was that the magic could be summoned outside of their body. Yet the area of effect was only about 5 meters or less. Witches that fell under this category were the witches who were the most suppressed by God's Stone of Retaliation. Once they stepped into its suppression zone, any magical effect would disappear. However, in the case that the power was used before it was blocked, the result was permanent and irreversible. The third type was the attaching magic type. This belonged to Hummingbird and Mystery Moon. Their magic was displayed by direct contact with their target. The conversion process was also very slow, and the consumption of magic was quite large, and it could always be interrupted by God's Stone of Retaliation. However, once the conversion was completed, the added properties became inherent properties, which were effective even within the suppressive area of the God's Stone of Retaliation. How long the enchantment took effect depended on the amount of magic power used and the object size. Most probably, this is also the reason why the God Stone of Retaliation is unable to suppress the rampaging magic during the demonic bite. He thought, God Stone of Retaliation doesn't affect the converging magic or the inner magical flow. It only affects magic during the processing time. Described in layman's terms, it only affects outside powers and no inside powers. Roland put the quill down and rubbed his eyes. No matter what, he was going to have a busy future. The witches were unable to sleep at this time. After having suffered for so long, they still couldn't believe that they were so welcomed by the prince. There were no fetters and no guards. The prince even allowed everyone to live within the castle, sleeping in such spacious rooms. Wendy had already guessed that her sisters would feel uneasy, so she, together with Nightingale, had went to collect all of their sisters and meet in one room. There they sat on the ground in a circle, happily chatting and calming their emotions. This is the manner that a leader should have, Leaves thought to herself. If it were Kara, who was absolutely scrupulous, she would never have noticed their condition, or even if she had noticed, she wouldn't see a reason to comfort her sisters. Sister Wendy, His Royal Highness, what shall we do? Hummingbird asked timidly. Our abilities are much worse than what you and Sister Nightingale can offer. This caused a feeling of resonance within her other sisters, who nodded to support her. NOV.L.B//JNN. Wendy, seeing this, began to laugh. Let me think. Well, the first thing you all should do is to practice your ability. Practice our ability? Soraya asked hesitantly. Does His Royal Highness want me to draw portraits of him all day long? Probably. Wendy patted Mystery Moon's head. You too. Even if Kara forbade you to use your ability in the camp, His Highness doesn't. Instead, he even encourages you to use and discover your own ability. But my ability brings problems to our sisters, said Mystery in a very low voice. Even if that is the case, you still need to practice, said Wendy categorically. It's to save your lives. What does life and death have to do with training our abilities? Leaves couldn't help herself from asking. Yes, the witches with His Highness method were able to safely survive the day of awakening. Nightingale interjected before Wendy could answer. From now on, we can bid farewell to the demonic bite. All of us sisters can easily pass the day of awakening. All the witches were now staring at Nightingale, and for the moment they couldn't believe what they heard. Are you speaking about what happened to Miss Anna? Scroll asked in astonishment. But last time you didn't tell us how she was able to accomplish it. Yes, at that time it was still only His Highness speculation. But in the meantime, it was also Nana's day of awakening. All day long she wasn't hurt. Then this method is... Scroll couldn't speak any further. It was just too unbelievable. As long as we can consume all of our magic power daily, Nightingale continued to explain, I'm able to see how the magic power within your bodies changes. Due to regular usage, your body is able to adapt to the magic and your magic reserves will also increase. While at the same time the suffering during the demonic bite will also be reduced. When it is close to your day of awakening, as long as you consume all your magic and keep your magic reserves empty, the demonic bite won't cause your body any harm. I think everyone can even faintly feel it. Wendy added, while we were always chased by the church, we always hid in the furthest parts of town, not daring to use our abilities. So every winter we lost many sisters. But this year, while living in the camp in the impassable mountain range, besides for Ari and Ami, everyone else was able to safely live through the day of awakening. Thinking about this, Leaves took a deep breath. When she had encountered the demonic bite while traveling through the wilderness, its duration was exceptionally short. In other words, the Holy Mountain is not a piece of land. Yes, the Holy Mountain isn't a place, Wendy nodded. As long as we can accept ourselves as what we are, not thinking of ourselves as the devil's subordinate, and when no longer hide our abilities, we are our own Holy Mountain. Wendy had even asked His Highness if he allowed her to go to the Witch Cooperation Association camp when the months of the demons had ended, to tell you the news. Nightingale looked at Wendy and softly said, like this, even if you hadn't found the Holy Mountain, you could still live freely within the mountains. Since everyone is here now, it is unnecessary to mention this. Wendy smiled and shook her head. It isn't important if you are needed by His Highness or not. Even if it's only for the reason to keep yourself safe, you need to practice every day. If this is really the key to release us from the demonic bite, can it be that other witches were already aware of this? Scroll asked, and after thinking for a moment, she answered her own question. We weren't the first witch society. The Kingdom of Dawn and the Wolfheart Kingdom had already their own societies. We even sent them letters inviting them to accompany us on our search for the Holy Mountain, but we never received any reply from them. Leaves gently sighed. She had the same thought, but didn't say it. Since Kara found the ancient book in the ruins at the eastern border of the Kingdom of Graycastle, she firmly believed in the Holy Mountain and took us all with her on her endeavor. At this point, the society started their long march into the exile almost across the entire kingdom. During the journey, we meet many new sisters, but we also lost a lot of them. If from the beginning we had hidden ourselves within the ruins, would we have found the key? We can try to contact the witches hiding in other cities, suggested Nightingale. This was His Highness' plan anyway. He wanted to let other witches know of this safe haven by releasing rumors. Like this, it would surely greatly release their worry. In the end, I still don't understand the point why His Highness should accept all of us witches, asked Echo, clearly confused. The southern witch had clearly suffered worse than most of the other witches. First, she was sold by her own people to a businessman of the port of Clearwater, who then took her all the way to the capital, selling her once again to the king. She was forced to learn the royal etiquette and how to dance. She even had to learn how to skillfully please a man. If it weren't for the Witch Cooperation Association who rescued her, she would probably already have been sold for an exorbitantly high price to the hands of a duke or minister. Until now, her speech had still her own southern accent. Maybe he is just the same like those who previously wanted to buy you, said Lily with a sneer. Men are... Don't talk about things you don't understand, Lily, said Nightingale, resolute and clearly unhappy. His Highness, Lord Roland, is clearly different from all those you spoke about. After all, some of us are already living here for quite a while. Let's end it here for today, decided Wendy, and said while still wearing her kind smile. It's already late, so everyone should go back to their rooms and try to get some sleep. Even if your ability really isn't useful to His Highness, he still said that what he wants is for all of you to be able to live a life in Border Town that is as normal as possible. If you want to know what His Highness will ask you tomorrow, it is, here she deliberately paused for a moment. I want you to accept this contract. After Scroll and Leaves had finally returned to their own room and closed their door, the former said, It's getting late, we should sleep now. Well, even before His Highness had asked about her ability, he had already arranged a room for her and Scroll together. Even so, he had said that this was only a temporary arrangement, and if the construction within the town was finished, she could get her own room. But in her view, this bed was spacious enough for 3 people, so it wasn't really a problem. She took off her coat, got under the quilt, and was immediately wrapped by an indescribable soft and comfortable feeling. After feeling so much pleasure from finally having a comfortable bed to sleep in, Leaves couldn't help herself and began to happily croon while burying her head into the pillow. After a long time, she softly asked, Do you blame Kara for what we had to face? Scroll kept silent for a very long time. Then she sighed and finally spoke. No one can predict the future, no matter what she later did. At least at the beginning, she really wanted to find a home for us witches, where we could live in peace without having to have anything bad in our minds. But this is of no importance. You should sleep now, child. With this, she closed her eyes and murmured, Good night. Just as Wendy had said. The next morning, directly after breakfast, a maid came and brought them to Roland's office. There the prince handed them a fine piece of parchment. Taking into account that some of the witches were illiterate, Scroll read its contents to them, followed by them signing it with their fingerprint. Roland knew that it was hard for them to understand the meaning of each line written in the contract, but this wasn't important. After some time, they would begin to understand what he wanted from them. He also knew, even if this was a slave contract, they would still have put their signature under it. But Roland didn't think that it was good to lose his principles just to get some small benefits. Since they chose to follow this road, we have to look to where it is leading them to. At the moment, everything he made was the laying of a foundation to form a positive cycle for the future. A long-term investment which should end in a win-win situation for both sides. After receiving the signed documents, Roland gave out the training plan he had developed yesterday evening and explained to each of them personally what they should do. When he had finished this, he called Leaves, Scroll, and Soraya back into his office. After closing the door, Nightingale showed a royal salute, startling her sisters. "I've been thinking all night long about the story I've heard yesterday from Wendy." Roland opened the curtains, letting bright sunlight flood into the room. "She said you had encountered a terrible monster, and only 7 of you were able to survive. Even your Witch Cooperation Association mentor, Kara, died within the wilderness. So I want to know what you have encountered. Was it a mixed species or a demonic beasts?" Leaves was the first to speak. "They weren't demonic beasts. They were devils coming from behind of the gate of hell. They possessed a tall body and were able to ride on demonic beasts. They were also able to use magic." She hesitated for a moment. "Just like us." "They were devils?" Roland frowned, turning his view to Soraya. "Were you also present at the scene?" The spoken-to nodded hesitantly. "You can draw the scene, right?" asked Roland and gave her a piece of paper. Soraya closed her eyes, remembering the painful memory. But regardless, she still took the paper and went to the table. Following this, she began to fully display her ability, taking her magic pen in hand. The pen started to release colorful light, which flew from her hand directly onto the paper. A lifelike picture gradually took form on the paper, and during the whole drawing process, Soraya never opened her eyes once. When Roland stepped near the table, he discovered that the picture's imagery looked very realistic. No, he had to correct himself. This wasn't a painting, but an image taken from a real-life scene. Her ability was just like a camera, reproducing the genocide in the wild from a first-person perspective. When she had completed the painting, Soraya's forehead was covered in sweat, clearly indicating that the memory was a nightmare to her. Nightingale went to the table too, taking a look and asked, "Are these the devils you had encountered?" "Yes, those are." Leaves pointed to the nearest one from the perspective the picture was taken. The devil, wearing metal gloves, was able to summon lightning attacks, while the other one was unusually strong. He could throw a spear several times faster than an arrow shot from a bow. More than a dozen sisters died under their hands. But they weren't able to use their special attack the whole time. It was in such a moment of re-sharing when I was able to kill them. "You were able to kill them on your own?" Roland asked. Kara's magic snake had ripped open Ironhand's pipe, and he eventually died from that wound. "I used the same method to kill the other one with a crossbow. The pipe seems to store some red gas, and if the gas leaks out, they die. Well, this thing seems to resemble an oxygen tank. How is it possible for creatures in the wild to have something like this?" Roland asked himself in confusion. But directly saying that they have to be aliens is a little too premature. Looking at their clothes, they are patched together out of pieces of leather and animal skins. This shows that their level of civilization can't be much further developed than ours is. Whether it was by using magic or technology that they were able to cross to other planets already shows their strength, while the people on Earth are still fighting against each other all the time. Of course, we cannot rule out the point that it's just an innate skill of an exotic civilization. Roland thought, for now, the important point is to remember that the devil is not an invincible enemy. They can be killed. In addition to the devil, we also saw a city floating in the sky, Leaves added. No matter how far we moved into its direction, it always stayed just in front of us. Lightning has mentioned something similar to it in her stories. I think she called it a mirage. Can you also draw a picture of the city? Roland asked in Soraya's direction. She nodded, summoned her pen once more, and begun to paint a city floating in the sky, just as Leaves had said. Roland viewed the picture carefully, but he was unable to get much information from the vague scenery. Even if the city displayed in the picture really is only a mirage, it still means that somewhere within the wildlands there has to be the real one. There seem to be red clouds above the city. Maybe this is the gas that is needed by the devils. This explanation is much more reasonable than thinking about aliens. After all, the vast wide lands behind the impassable mountain range is a complete mystery zone, where for a long time no one had set their feet into, so detecting a new race isn't too surprising. I heard from Nightingale and Wendy that Kara decided to look for the Holy Mountain after she read about it in an ancient book, Roland asked. Scroll, have you also read the book? Scroll hesitated for a moment, but then she answered. Kara didn't allow anyone to read the book, but I've still seen a little, but the text was quite messy, yet also incredible. Can you make a copy of it and show me? The text written in the book isn't true, Your Royal Highness. That the Holy Mountain doesn't exist confirmed this. She sighed, but still raised her right hand. I hope you won't get confused by the book's content. Suddenly a book out of golden light appeared midair. The book flipped open, and its sides turned with an incredible speed. When the book came to its end, it fell directly into Scroll's hands. Your Highness, I hope you are the only person who will read it. I don't want to see any of my sisters become like Kara. Roland took the book out Scroll's hands and comforted her. I got it. When the other witches left the office, Nightingale quietly appeared sitting on the couch. She had lifted up her robe, as usual, and placed both her feet on the table and chewed happily on a dried fish. You don't want to see it? Roland, with a smile on his face, asked. With a scoffing voice, she answered. I'm not interested in anything that lunatic loved to look at. Roland shook his head, sat himself back behind the table, and carefully opened the book. The pages felt just as if the book has become a reality. Just like Scroll had said, most of the content was messed up. It seemed as if the text wasn't written in the common language. At least the grammar wasn't the same. Within the book, a blood moon was mentioned, as well as a huge stone gate, but nowhere did he find any trace of the holy city. In fact, apart from some words he was occasionally able to understand, the meaning of many other words wasn't clear for him. Most of the book's content he just couldn't read. In the end, his summary was, even if I knew every word, I'm not sure if I would be able to understand it completely. I'm not sure if it is because of the short peak Scroll was only able to take, or if the book was just recorded this way. Roland skipped through the long passages, jumping straight to the end. Even so, the book was quite thick, it had very little content, and most of its sides were blank. But when he turned to the last page, he suddenly saw a readable text. The previous neat writing became illegible, as it had been written down in a hurry, but the content was understandable and cleared many questions. N/O/vel/b//jn.c//om. The first sentence, still written in neat handwriting, was, "We have failed. Mortals cannot overcome the devil.